Welcome, fellow dreamer. Tonight, we journey to the ancient land of Persia, where mighty empires rose beneath endless skies and left their mark upon the world for centuries to come. Our story is woven with soothing music and abstract imagery, gently uncovering the wonders of Persian innovation, artistry, and wisdom. Fascinating tales to feed your curiosity as you drift peacefully towards sleep. So take a deep breath, sink into comfort, and allow your mind and eyes to rest as we explore the legacy of Cyrus the Great, the grandeur of the Achaemenid Empire, and the enduring achievements of the Parthian and Sasanian dynasties that shaped civilization itself. The land that would become Ancient Persia stretches across a vast plateau in Western Asia, a place where earth and sky seem to merge in endless horizons. This is the Iranian Plateau, a realm of dramatic contrast where snow-capped mountains tower above scorching deserts and fertile valleys nestle between harsh, rocky expanses. It is a landscape that has witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations for thousands of years, each leaving its mark upon the dusty earth and contributing to a tapestry of human achievement that would eventually give birth to one of history's most remarkable empires. The plateau itself sits like an elevated stage, bordered by mountain ranges that have long served as natural barriers and highways alike. To the north, the Alborz Mountains rise majestically, their peaks catching the first light of dawn. To the west, the Zagros Mountains form a rugged spine that has channeled the movement of peoples and ideas for millennia. These mountains are not merely stone and snow. They are vessels of memory, containing within their valleys and passes the stories of countless generations who traversed them in search of better grazing lands, trade opportunities, or simply a place to call home. Between these mountain ranges, the land transforms into a patchwork of environments. There are fertile river valleys where waters flow down from the highlands, bringing life to fields of grain and orchards heavy with fruit. There are salt deserts, vast and shimmering in the heat, where survival requires intimate knowledge of hidden water sources and the patience to wait for the cool of evening before traveling. The climate itself is a study in extremes, with bitterly cold winters in the highlands and summers that can drive temperatures to levels that test human endurance. Yet, it was precisely this challenging environment that shaped the character of the peoples who would come to inhabit it, teaching them resourcefulness, resilience, and the art of adaptation. Long before Persian kings would dream of empire, other peoples made their homes in this demanding land. Among the earliest were the Elamites, who established themselves in the southwestern reaches of the plateau, in the region that would later become known as Khuzestan. The Elamites built cities and developed a sophisticated culture that flourished for thousands of years. Their capital, Susa, became a center of learning and commerce, strategically positioned where the plateau meets the Mesopotamian lowlands. The Elamites developed their own system of writing, created beautiful artwork, and engaged in complex diplomatic relations with their neighbors in Mesopotamia. They understood the value of the plateau's resources, mining copper and other metals from the mountain ranges, and they knew how to harness the limited water supplies to support agriculture in an often unforgiving environment. The archaeological evidence left behind by these early inhabitants tells a story of gradual development and increasing complexity. Simple farming villages gave way to towns, and towns eventually grew into cities. People learned to domesticate animals suited to the plateau's conditions, with sheep and goats thriving in areas where other livestock might struggle. They discovered how to cultivate crops that could withstand the temperature extremes and make use of seasonal rains. They developed trade networks that connected different regions of the plateau and reached beyond the mountains to distant land. As centuries passed, new groups of people began arriving on the plateau, part of the great migrations of Indo-European peoples that reshaped much of Asia and Europe during the second millennium before the Common Era. These newcomers, who would eventually be known as Iranian peoples, did not arrive all at once in a single wave. Rather, they came gradually, in groups large and small, over many generations. Some were nomadic herders, moving with their flocks in search of pasture. Others were warrior bands seeking new territories. Many were families simply looking for a better life, drawn by stories of fertile valleys and opportunities in this highland realm. These Iranian migrants brought with them their own languages, customs, and traditions. They were skilled horsemen, a talent developed on the vast steppes of Central Asia from which they had originated. They brought knowledge of metalworking, particularly bronze and later iron, which gave them advantages in crafting tools and weapons. They had their own religious beliefs and social structures, and as they settled into their new homeland, these began to blend with the cultures of the peoples already living there, creating something new and distinctive. Among these Iranian groups were two that would prove particularly significant to the story of ancient Persia: the Medes and the Persians themselves. The Medes settled primarily in the northwestern regions of the plateau, in the area around what is now northwestern Iran. They established themselves in the fertile valleys of the Zagros Mountains, where they built fortified settlements and developed a reputation as formidable warriors and skilled administrators. The Persians, meanwhile, made their home in the southern reaches of the plateau, in a region that came to be known as Parsa, or Persis, from which the name Persia itself derives. This land, though harsh in many respects, offered enough resources to support a growing population, and its position gave the Persians access to important trade routes connecting the plateau with the Persian Gulf and the lands beyond. Life on the plateau required cooperation and organization. Communities had to work together to manage water resources, defend against raiders, and maintain the complex systems necessary for survival in such a challenging environment. These necessities fostered the development of social hierarchies and governance structures. Chiefs became kings, and kings began to build more elaborate courts and administrative systems. Tribal affiliations remained important, but they were gradually supplemented by new forms of organization based on territory and function. The natural resources of the plateau, while requiring effort to access, were considerable. The mountains contained deposits of copper, tin, gold, silver, and precious stones. The valleys could produce abundant harvests when properly irrigated. The grasslands supported large herds of horses, sheep, and cattle. And the strategic position of the plateau, sitting between Mesopotamia, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and the steppes to the north, meant that trade routes naturally passed through Persian territories, bringing goods, ideas, and cultural influences from across the known world. By the middle of the first millennium before the Common Era, the Iranian plateau had become a complex mosaic of peoples, cultures, and political entities. The Median kingdom had grown into a significant regional power, while the Persians continued to develop their own identity and capabilities in their southern homeland. The stage was being set for dramatic changes that would transform not only the plateau itself, but the entire ancient world. The descendants of those early migrants and the inheritors of the Elamite legacy were about to embark on a journey that would create an empire unprecedented in scale and sophistication, one that would be remembered for thousands of years to come. In the chieftain's halls of Parsa, a young man was coming of age who would change the course of history forever. The child who would reshape the ancient world was born around 600 BCE in the rugged highlands of Persis, in what is now southwestern Iran. His name was Cyrus, and the circumstances of his birth would later be wrapped in layers of legend and mystery, as befits a figure who would come to be called the Great. Yet beneath the mythological embroidery lies the story of a remarkable leader whose vision and character would establish patterns of governance that echo through millennia. Cyrus was born into the Achaemenid clan, a noble family among the Persian tribes. His grandfather, Astyages, ruled the Median Empire, the dominant power that controlled much of the Iranian plateau and beyond. The Persians themselves were vassals to the Medes, their close relatives who spoke a similar language and shared many cultural traditions. This relationship between Medes and Persians was complex, neither entirely hostile nor fully harmonious, but rather the natural hierarchy of tribes and kingdoms that characterized the ancient world. The young Cyrus grew up in a world shaped by the harsh beauty of the Persian highlands. Here, rocky mountains gave way to fertile valleys, and the people lived lives divided between settled agriculture and the pastoral traditions of their nomadic ancestors. The Persian nobility were expected to master 3 essential skills: riding horses, shooting arrows, and speaking the truth. These values would profoundly influence the character of the man Cyrus would become. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who recorded stories about Cyrus more than a century after his death, the child's birth was preceded by troubling dreams that caused King Astyages to fear his grandson might one day overthrow him. The tale goes that the king ordered the infant exposed on a mountainside, but a herdsman and his wife took pity on the child and raised him as their own. Whether this story contains any historical truth, or is merely a literary device common to hero tales across cultures, we cannot say with certainty. What we do know is that by the time Cyrus reached adulthood, he had become the leader of the Persian tribes, inheriting this position from his father Cambyses around 559 BCE. The Persia that Cyrus inherited was a collection of tribes united by language and custom, but subject to Median overlordship. The Persians paid tribute to their Median cousins and provided military support when called upon. For a lesser man, this arrangement might have seemed the natural order of things, unchangeable and eternal. But Cyrus possessed a quality that set him apart, the ability to see beyond the present moment and imagine a different future. In the early years of his rule, Cyrus focused on consolidating his position among the Persian tribes. This was no small task, for the Persians were proud and independent-minded, accustomed to their own chiefs and local traditions. Cyrus needed to transform these loosely connected groups into a unified force capable of acting with single purpose. He accomplished this not through force or intimidation, but through personal charisma, fair dealing, and a demonstrated commitment to Persian interests and dignity. The relationship between the Persian and Median courts during this period remains somewhat mysterious to historians, obscured by time and conflicting accounts. What seems clear is that tensions grew between Cyrus and his grandfather Astyages. Whether this stemmed from the old king's suspicions, from Cyrus's growing independence, or from broader dissatisfaction among Median nobles with Astyages' rule, the situation moved gradually but inexorably toward confrontation. Around 553 BCE, the simmering tensions erupted into open conflict. Cyrus raised the standard of rebellion, declaring Persian independence from Median rule. This was an audacious move, challenging a power that had dominated the region for decades. The Median Empire controlled vast territories and commanded substantial military resources. By all conventional calculations, Cyrus's rebellion should have been crushed swiftly and completely. Yet Cyrus had prepared his ground carefully. He had cultivated alliances among other peoples, chafing under Median dominance. More importantly, he had earned a reputation for fairness and keeping his word, qualities that would prove more valuable than any fortress or army. When Astyages marched against his rebellious vassal, something remarkable happened. Portions of the Median army defected to Cyrus, unwilling to fight against a leader who promised a more just and prosperous future. The war between Medes and Persians lasted perhaps 3 years, though the exact chronology remains uncertain. What is certain is that by 550 BCE, Cyrus had captured the Median capital of Ecbatana and taken Astyages prisoner. Here, at this pivotal moment, Cyrus demonstrated the quality that would define his reign and distinguish him from countless other conquerors throughout history. Rather than executing his grandfather or destroying the Median nobility, Cyrus treated them with respect and dignity. He presented his victory not as the conquest of one people by another, but as a unification of related peoples under new leadership. This approach was revolutionary. The ancient world was accustomed to conquest, followed by subjugation, humiliation, and often massacre. Cyrus offered something different: partnership and inclusion. He kept Ecbatana as one of his capitals, incorporated Median nobles into his court, and preserved Median institutions and traditions. The empire he was building would be genuinely Persian and Median, drawing on the strengths of both peoples. With the resources of the former Median Empire now at his command, Cyrus stood at the threshold of greatness. The young leader who had unified the Persian tribes now controlled territories stretching from the borders of Lydia in the west to the edge of Central Asian steppes in the east. But this was merely the foundation. The true test of his vision and abilities lay ahead, in the campaigns and governance decisions that would transform a regional power into the largest empire the world had yet seen. As night settles over our story, we leave Cyrus in those early years of triumph, master of Persis and Media, his eyes already turning toward new horizons. The pattern of his rule was now established: bold action tempered by mercy, military prowess combined with diplomatic wisdom, and above all, a conception of empire not as domination, but as the bringing together of diverse peoples under laws that applied justly to all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Anshan plateau as Cyrus stood at the threshold of his greatest ambitions. Behind him lay the unified Persian tribes and the absorbed Median kingdom. Before him stretched a world of ancient civilizations, each with its own proud history, waiting to be woven into something unprecedented. The year was approximately 547 before the Common Era, and the young king who had already accomplished so much was about to transform the nature of empire itself. To the west, beyond the rugged highlands and across the great river systems, lay the kingdom of Lydia. Its ruler, King Croesus, had watched the rise of Cyrus with growing concern. Lydia was fabulously wealthy, its riches legendary throughout the ancient world. The kingdom controlled vital trade routes and had developed an innovation that would change human commerce forever: coined money. These small, standardized pieces of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, bore the stamp of royal authority and could be trusted in markets from one end of the known world to the other. Croesus had consulted the oracle at Delphi, seeking guidance about whether to move against this rising Persian power. The oracle's answer, as was often the case, proved ambiguous in ways the Lydian king failed to appreciate. He gathered his forces and marched eastward, certain that the gods favored his cause. The two armies met in Cappadocia, in what is now central Turkey, and fought to an inconclusive draw. As autumn turned to winter, Croesus withdrew to his capital at Sardis, dismissing his mercenary forces as was customary during the cold months when campaigning became difficult. But Cyrus understood that convention could become a weakness when an opponent expected it to be followed. Rather than retiring to winter quarters, the Persian army pressed westward through the mountain passes. The surprise was complete. Croesus hastily reassembled what forces he could and met the Persians on the plain before Sardis. Here, the Lydians deployed their pride: heavy cavalry mounted on magnificent war horses, trained for close combat. Cyrus, however, had brought along his supply train's camels, and he now moved these ungainly creatures to the front of his formation. The Lydian horses, unfamiliar with the sight and smell of camels, became unmanageable. Their riders found themselves fighting their own mounts rather than the enemy. The Persian infantry advanced steadily, and the Lydian forces broke. Sardis fell after a brief siege, and with it came control of the Aegean coast and access to the Greek cities that dotted the shoreline. What happened next would echo through the centuries. Rather than executing Croesus or treating him with cruelty, Cyrus showed the defeated king respect. Ancient accounts suggest he even sought Croesus's counsel on matters of governance. This was not mere magnanimity, but rather the beginning of a deliberate philosophy of rule. Cyrus had observed that empires built on terror and subjugation often crumbled when the iron hand loosened even slightly. He envisioned something different, an empire where conquered peoples might find reasons to participate willingly in their own governance. With Lydia secured, Cyrus turned his attention to the greatest prize of all: Babylon, the ancient city that had stood for millennia, whose very name meant Gate of the Gods. Babylon was the jewel of Mesopotamia, a city of such grandeur that its hanging gardens would be counted among the wonders of the ancient world. Its walls were so thick that chariots could race along their tops. The Euphrates River flowed directly through the city's heart, providing both beauty and practical advantage. But Babylon, in the mid-6th century, before the Common Era, was an empire in decline. Its ruler, Nabonidus, had alienated the powerful priesthood by favoring the moon god Sin over Marduk, the traditional patron deity of Babylon. He had spent years away from the city, leaving its administration to his son Belshazzar. The people murmured their discontent in the marketplaces. The priests whispered that the gods had withdrawn their favor. Cyrus approached this situation with characteristic strategic patience. Rather than simply marching an army to Babylon's formidable walls, he conducted a campaign of diplomacy and intelligence. He sent envoys who quietly spread word that the Persian king honored all gods, that he believed each people should worship according to their own traditions. In temples and trading houses, a different vision of the future began to take shape, one where Babylon might preserve its dignity and prosperity under new management. When Cyrus finally moved against Babylon in 539 before the Common Era, the military campaign proved almost anticlimactic. According to ancient chronicles, Persian engineers diverted the Euphrates River into a canal or marshland, lowering the water level enough that soldiers could wade along the riverbed beneath the city's river gates. Whether this account is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, the result remains clear. Babylon fell with minimal resistance. The great city opened its gates, and Cyrus entered not as a destroyer, but as a liberator. What followed would define the character of the Achaemenid Empire for generations to come. Cyrus issued a decree, preserved on a clay cylinder, inscribed with cuneiform script, that stands as one of history's most remarkable documents. In this declaration, he presented himself as chosen by Marduk, the god of Babylon, to restore proper governance. He announced that he would return displaced peoples to their homelands and restore their temples. He proclaimed that those who had been forcibly moved would be free to return to their ancestral lands, taking with them the sacred objects that had been confiscated. Among those who benefited from this policy were the Jewish people, who had been living in Babylonian captivity since Nebuchadnezzar had destroyed Jerusalem decades earlier. Cyrus permitted them to return to Judea and rebuild their temple. This act would earn him unique distinction in their sacred texts, where he is called a Messiah, an anointed one, though he himself was not of their faith. The cylinder decree was more than a single act of mercy. It represented a governing philosophy that recognized the strength that could come from diversity, the wisdom of allowing different peoples to maintain their own identities while contributing to a greater whole. In an age when conquest typically meant the systematic erasure of local cultures and the imposition of the conqueror's gods and customs, Cyrus chose a different path. This approach was not purely altruistic. A practical, strategic mind guided these decisions. Cyrus understood that garrisons could control cities, but they could not make them productive. Soldiers could suppress rebellion, but they could not generate the wealth, creativity, and voluntary cooperation that made an empire truly strong. By offering respect and autonomy, he transformed potential resistance into partnership. As the sun set over Babylon on the evening of Cyrus's entry into the city, the foundation of the Achaemenid Empire stood complete. From the Aegean to the Persian Gulf, from the Mediterranean to the borders of India, a new kind of political entity had come into being. It would grow larger still, but the essential character was now established. This would be an empire of roads and messages, of diverse peoples united under a central authority that was strong enough to maintain order, yet flexible enough to accommodate difference. In the cool evening air, as merchants returned to homes they feared they might lose, as priests offered prayers in temples they thought might be destroyed, a new possibility had entered human consciousness. That empire need not mean uniformity, that power need not require the obliteration of everything that came before. The story of how this vision would be maintained and expanded across generations was only beginning. With Babylon secured, and the boundaries of his realm extending farther than any Persian had dreamed possible, Cyrus faced a challenge perhaps greater than conquest itself. How does one rule an empire that stretches across deserts and mountains, encompassing peoples who speak different languages, worship different gods, and follow different customs? The answer Cyrus and his successors developed would become one of ancient Persia's most enduring legacies, a system of governance so effective that its echoes would resonate through millennia. The vast territories now under Persian control could not be managed from a single location, using the methods that had worked for smaller kingdoms. Distance alone presented an enormous obstacle. A messenger traveling from the eastern edges of the empire to its western boundaries would need months to complete the journey. How could a king respond to crises, collect taxes, or maintain order across such distances? The solution emerged gradually, refined through experience and necessity, until it became the sophisticated administrative framework that held the empire together. At the heart of this system lay the concept of the satrapy. Rather than attempting to govern every province directly from the capital, Cyrus divided his empire into administrative regions, each overseen by a satrap, a governor who served as the king's representative. The word itself meant protector of the realm, and these officials bore tremendous responsibility. They collected tribute, maintained order, administered justice, and commanded local military forces. Yet they were not independent rulers. Each satrap remained accountable to the king, bound by elaborate systems of checks and balances that prevented any single official from accumulating too much power. The genius of this arrangement lay in its flexibility. Cyrus understood that different regions required different approaches. In Babylon, where ancient traditions ran deep and the population took pride in their sophisticated civilization, Persian rule was implemented gently, with respect for local customs and religious practices. In newer territories, where Persian authority was less established, military governors maintained a more visible presence. The satraps adapted their governance to local conditions, while ensuring that tribute flowed to the royal treasury and Persian law remained supreme. To prevent satraps from becoming too comfortable in their power, or perhaps too ambitious, the Persian kings employed a network of officials known as the eyes and ears of the king. These royal inspectors traveled throughout the empire, appearing without warning to audit a satrap's administration, investigate complaints, and report directly to the king. They examined financial records, interviewed local officials and citizens, and assessed the military readiness of provincial forces. A satrap who ruled wisely and fairly had nothing to fear from these inspections. But those who enriched themselves at the empire's expense or governed harshly soon found themselves replaced, or worse. Yet even this system of governors and inspectors would have failed without the infrastructure to connect the empire's far-flung regions. The Persians understood that information and people needed to move swiftly across great distances. Under Darius, Cyrus's eventual successor, this understanding would blossom into one of the ancient world's most impressive engineering achievements, the Royal Road. Though the foundations of this system began during Cyrus's reign, it was Darius who would expand and perfect it. The Royal Road stretched for more than 1,500 miles, connecting Susa, one of Persia's royal cities, with Sardis near the Aegean coast. Along this route, the Persians established rest stations approximately every 15 miles, where royal messengers could obtain fresh horses, food, and shelter. These stations, called Chapar Khaneh, became the beating heart of imperial communication. A message that might have taken 3 months for an ordinary traveler to carry could be delivered in just 7 days by the royal postal system, with riders galloping from station to station, passing urgent communications from one courier to the next without pause. The roads themselves represented a massive investment of labor and resources. Persian engineers leveled mountains, built bridges across rivers, and carved pathways through rocky terrain. In marshy areas, they constructed raised causeways. Through deserts, they established wells and storage facilities. Every element of these routes served the empire's need for rapid, reliable communication and transport. Merchants quickly recognized the value of these roads, and trade caravans began following the paths that royal engineers had carved across the landscape, bringing prosperity alongside administrative efficiency. Beyond the royal road, the Persians maintained an extensive network of secondary routes connecting provincial capitals with remote regions. Military units patrolled these roads, protecting travelers from bandits and ensuring safe passage for merchants, officials, and pilgrims alike. This security, combined with the physical infrastructure, transformed travel across the empire. What had once been perilous journeys through hostile wilderness became, if not comfortable, at least manageable undertakings. The administrative innovations extended to financial matters as well. Managing an empire required substantial revenue, and the Persians developed sophisticated methods for collecting and tracking tribute from their many territories. Different regions contributed according to their resources and wealth. Some provinces paid in precious metals, while others provided soldiers, horses, or agricultural products. The Persians maintained detailed records of these obligations, and while they demanded regular payment, their tribute requirements remained generally reasonable, at least by ancient standards. To facilitate trade and tax collection, the Persians developed standardized weights and measures, making commerce across the empire more straightforward. Later, under Darius, they would introduce a standardized coinage system, the gold daric, which became recognized and accepted throughout the ancient world. These innovations might seem mundane compared to magnificent palaces or military conquests, but they formed the practical foundation upon which imperial grandeur rested. Communication across this vast empire required more than roads and messengers. The Persians confronted the challenge of linguistic diversity pragmatically. While Old Persian remained the language of the royal family and court, Aramaic, already widely spoken throughout the Near East, became the empire's administrative language. Official documents, written in Aramaic on clay tablets or papyrus scrolls, could be understood by educated officials from Egypt to Bactria. This linguistic flexibility, like so many aspects of Persian administration, reflected a willingness to adopt practical solutions regardless of their origin. The empire's infrastructure also included elaborate systems for water management, particularly crucial in the arid regions that comprised much of Persian territory. Though the full development of the Qanat system would come later, the foundations were laid during these early years. These underground channels carried water from mountain sources to agricultural lands and cities, allowing cultivation in regions that would otherwise have remained desert. The engineering knowledge required for such projects demonstrated the Persians' sophisticated understanding of hydraulics and their commitment to developing their territories. As night settles across the ancient Persian realm, we can imagine the lights of countless rest stations flickering along the royal road, beacons of order and connection across vast distances. In provincial capitals, satraps review their records, knowing that the king's inspectors might arrive at any time. Messengers prepare for dawn departures, carrying edicts, reports, and news across mountains and plains. This vast machinery of governance, this intricate web of roads and officials, messengers and inspectors would allow Cyrus's successors to maintain and even expand the empire he had founded, turning conquest into lasting civilization. The torches flickered in the palace corridors as news arrived from distant lands. Cyrus the Great had departed this world, leaving behind an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the borders of India. The weight of this vast realm now rested upon the shoulders of his son, a man who had grown up in the shadow of perhaps the greatest conqueror the world had yet known. Cambyses, too, inherited not merely territories and treasures, but an expectation, a legacy that demanded continuation and perhaps even expansion. As Cambyses assumed the throne, his gaze turned southwest, toward a land that had captured the imagination of civilizations for millennia. Egypt, with its ancient pyramids reaching toward the heavens, its mysterious temples, and its seemingly endless wealth, stood as the one great prize that had eluded his father's conquering armies. The Nile Valley represented more than just another territory to be added to Persian maps. It was a civilization that predated even the most ancient Persian memories, a land where pharaohs had ruled when the Iranian plateau was still home only to scattered tribes. The young king understood that conquering Egypt would require more than military might. The Egyptians possessed a proud history and a complex society that had weathered numerous invasions over thousands of years. Their culture had absorbed conquerors before, transforming foreign rulers into Egyptian pharaohs through the power of their ancient traditions. Cambyses would need to approach this campaign with both strategic wisdom and cultural sensitivity. In the year that we might calculate as 525 before the Common Era, Persian forces began their march toward the land of the pharaohs. The journey itself presented formidable challenges. Between Persia and Egypt lay vast stretches of desert, territories where water was more precious than gold, and where a single miscalculation could doom an entire army to perish beneath the relentless sun. Cambyses demonstrated considerable organizational skill in arranging supply lines and securing agreements with Arab tribes who controlled the desert routes and knew the locations of precious water sources. The Persian army that approached Egypt's borders was a reflection of the empire's diversity. Alongside Persian soldiers marched warriors from Media, troops from the recently conquered territories of Lydia, and contingents from numerous other regions. This multinational force represented not just military strength, but the administrative capability of the Achaemenid system that Cyrus had established and that Cambyses now commanded. When the two armies finally met in battle at Pelusium, near the mouth of the Nile, the encounter would be remembered in both Persian and Egyptian records. The Egyptians, led by Pharaoh Psamtik III, fought to defend their ancestral homeland with the desperation of those who understood what defeat might mean. Yet the Persian forces, battle-hardened from campaigns across the known world and organized according to the efficient military systems developed under Cyrus, proved victorious. The ancient capital of Memphis opened its gates to the conqueror, and Egypt became a province of the Persian Empire. What followed next revealed much about Cambyses as a ruler and about the complexities of governing such diverse territories. Unlike his father, whose reputation for tolerance and respect for local customs had become legendary, Cambyses faced accusations and stories that painted a more complicated picture. Ancient sources, though we must read them with careful consideration of their origins and potential biases, describe a ruler who struggled with the responsibilities of governing Egypt and who may have made decisions that alienated some of the Egyptian priesthood and nobility. Some accounts tell of Cambyses attempting to adopt Egyptian customs and present himself as a legitimate pharaoh in the traditional manner. Other sources suggest tensions arose between the new Persian administration and the powerful Egyptian religious establishments. The truth, as is often the case with ancient history, likely lies in a more nuanced middle ground, obscured by the mists of time and the agendas of ancient historians. What we can say with greater certainty is that Cambyses established Persian control over Egypt and sought to extend his reach even further into Africa. Ambitious plans were laid for campaigns beyond Egypt's traditional borders, into regions that the Persians knew little about. These ventures into Nubia, and possibly toward the western deserts, met with varying degrees of success, and logistical challenges in these remote territories tested even the capable Persian administrative systems. During his time ruling Egypt, Cambyses remained far from the heartland of his empire for extended periods. This distance created its own complications. The vast Persian territories required constant attention from their ruler, and absence from the central provinces meant relying heavily on the satrapal system and trusted administrators to maintain order and collect tribute. The infrastructure that Cyrus had built, and that we learned about in earlier parts of our story, now faced a significant test. As seasons passed and years accumulated, events in Egypt and beyond would set the stage for changes in Persian leadership. The details surrounding the end of Cambyses' reign remain somewhat unclear in our historical sources, with different accounts offering varying explanations. What emerged from this period was a temporary uncertainty in the empire, a moment when the question of succession and legitimate authority would need to be resolved. The conquest of Egypt represented a significant achievement for the Persian Empire, adding one of the ancient world's most storied civilizations to the growing list of territories under Achaemenid control. The Nile Valley brought with it immense agricultural wealth, access to African trade routes, and the prestige of ruling over a land that commanded respect throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond. Egyptian grain would flow into Persian storehouses, Egyptian artisans would contribute their skills to imperial projects, and the ancient wisdom of Egyptian priests would join the accumulated knowledge of the empire. Yet the Egyptian conquest also illustrated the challenges inherent in managing such diverse territories. Each region brought its own traditions, expectations, and complexities. The genius of the Achaemenid system lay in finding ways to honor local customs while maintaining imperial unity, to allow regional diversity while ensuring central authority. This delicate balance would continue to challenge Persian rulers throughout the empire's history. As night settles over our story and the events of Cambyses' reign fade into the past, the stage is set for new chapters in the Persian story. The empire that Cyrus had founded and that Cambyses had expanded now awaited new leadership, new vision, and new challenges that would test the foundations of Achaemenid power in ways that neither of these rulers could have fully anticipated. The death of Cambyses in 522 before the Common Era left the vast Persian Empire in a state of profound uncertainty. As news traveled slowly along the dusty roads from Egypt back toward the Persian heartland, a crisis of succession was already unfolding. Into this moment of vulnerability stepped a young nobleman named Darius, whose claim to the throne was not immediately obvious, yet whose determination and vision would reshape the empire into its most enduring form. Darius belonged to a different branch of the Achaemenid family, tracing his lineage back to a common ancestor with Cyrus the Great. He was serving as a spear-bearer to Cambyses when the king died under circumstances that remain somewhat mysterious even today. According to the account, Darius himself would later inscribe on a massive cliff face at Behistun, a religious impostor named Gaumata had seized the throne, claiming to be Cambyses' younger brother, Bardia. Whether this was truly an impostor, whether it was indeed Bardia attempting to claim his rightful place, has been debated by historians. But what matters for our story is what Darius believed, or at least what he proclaimed. Together with 6 other Persian nobles, Darius entered the royal palace and confronted the man on the throne. In the struggle that followed, the supposed impostor was killed, and Darius emerged as the new king. It was September of 522, and Darius was perhaps 28 years old. Assuming control of an empire that stretched across 3 continents and encompassed dozens of diverse peoples. But claiming the throne and securing it proved to be 2 very different challenges. As word spread of the sudden change in leadership, rebellions erupted across the empire like flames catching in dry grass. Babylon declared independence under a leader claiming to be a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar. In Persia itself, rival claimants arose. Media rebelled. Parthia and Margiana in the east refused to recognize the new king. Egypt, so recently conquered, saw an opportunity to break free. Elam rose in revolt. Armenia rejected Persian authority. It seemed as though the great empire that Cyrus had built and Cambyses had expanded might fragment into a dozen pieces. Darius responded with remarkable energy and military skill. He divided his forces, sending trusted generals to deal with some rebellions, while he personally led campaigns against others. One by one, over the course of 2 years, he suppressed these uprisings. The young king seemed to be everywhere at once, racing from one end of his fractured realm to another, demonstrating both mercy to those who surrendered and swift consequences for those who continued to resist. By 520, the empire was whole again, perhaps even more firmly under central control than it had been before the crisis. To legitimize his rule and ensure that future generations understood his version of these events, Darius commissioned one of the most remarkable monuments of the ancient world. High on a cliff face at Behistun, on the road between Babylon and Ecbatana, he ordered stonemasons to carve a massive relief sculpture and inscription. The image showed Darius with his foot upon a fallen enemy, receiving the submission of 9 rebel kings who stood bound before him. Above the scene hovered the winged symbol of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of the Zoroastrian faith, blessing the rightful king. The inscription itself, written in 3 languages, Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, told the story of Darius's rise to power and his victories over the rebels. The monument stood hundreds of feet above the ground, visible to travelers on the ancient road, but nearly impossible to reach, ensuring its preservation for millennia. It would eventually provide the key that allowed modern scholars to decipher cuneiform writing, but in Darius's time, its purpose was clear: to proclaim his legitimacy and divine right to rule. With the empire secured, Darius turned his attention to reorganization and consolidation. He kept the basic administrative structure of satrapies that Cyrus had established, but refined and standardized it. He divided the empire into 20 satrapies, carefully defining their boundaries and the tribute each was expected to provide. The satrap of each province was a powerful figure, often of royal blood, but Darius instituted a system of checks and balances to prevent any one governor from becoming too independent. He appointed separate military commanders in each province, not subject to the satrap's authority, and he created a network of inspectors known as the eyes and ears of the king, who traveled throughout the empire, reporting directly to him. To facilitate the flow of information and trade across his vast domains, Darius expanded and improved the network of roads begun under Cyrus. The royal road became more than just a path. It was maintained, measured, and equipped with regular stations where royal messengers could change horses. This allowed messages to travel from Sardis on the Aegean coast to Susa in Persia in just 7 days, a journey that would take an ordinary traveler 3 months. Along these roads, royal inspectors, merchants, soldiers, and pilgrims moved in an endless flow, binding the empire together. Darius also standardized the imperial coinage system, introducing the gold daric and the silver siglos, which became the trusted currency throughout the empire and beyond. This monetary standardization greatly facilitated trade and made the collection of tribute more efficient. The daric, stamped with the image of the king as an archer, would remain in use for generations, a testament to Darius's organizational genius. Perhaps recognizing that a great empire needed a great capital, Darius began planning and constructing Persepolis, a ceremonial center that would surpass all others in grandeur. On a terrace carved from the mountainside in the homeland of Persia, he laid the foundations for palaces, audience halls, and treasuries that would take decades to complete. This would not be merely a capital, but a statement in stone of Persian power and sophistication, a place where representatives from all corners of the empire would gather to pay homage, and where the king could display the glory of his realm. Under Darius, the empire found its mature form. The systems he established for administration, communication, taxation, and succession would serve the Achaemenid dynasty for nearly 2 centuries. He transformed what might have been a temporary conquest into an enduring civilization, creating structures that could survive the death of any single ruler. The young nobleman who had seized the throne in uncertain circumstances had proven himself not just a warrior and politician, but a visionary organizer who understood that true power required more than military might. It required systems that could channel and sustain that power across generations and vast distances. As Darius's reign progressed, the empire he had fought so hard to preserve entered a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural flowering, its foundations now secured by the capable hands of this remarkable king. The morning sun rose over an empire that stretched farther than any the world had yet seen. Under the careful governance of Darius III, the Achaemenid Empire had reached its magnificent zenith, encompassing lands that spanned from the banks of the Indus River in the east to the shores of the Aegean Sea in the west, from the steppes beyond the Oxus River in the north to the cataracts of the Nile in the south. This was a realm of unprecedented diversity, where dozens of peoples, languages, and traditions coexisted under the protection of the great king. Imagine standing at the crossroads of the royal road, watching the endless procession of travelers passing by. Here comes a merchant from Bactria, his camels laden with lapis lazuli, destined for the workshops of Susa. There goes an Egyptian scribe carrying papyrus scrolls containing tax records for his province. A group of Greek artisans travels eastward, hired to work on a new palace complex, while Phoenician sailors discuss maritime routes that will carry them from Tyre to distant ports along the Arabian coast. This was the living tapestry of the Persian Empire at its height, a world where distance had been conquered by organization and diversity had been transformed into strength. The empire that Darius governed contained perhaps 50 million souls, though the exact number remains lost to time. These people spoke countless languages and dialects. In the western provinces, Greek, Lydian, and Aramaic filled the marketplaces. Egyptian hieroglyphs adorned temple walls along the Nile, while cuneiform tablets recorded transactions in Babylon. In the eastern reaches, the languages of Bactria and Sogdiana mixed with local tongues. And in the heart of the empire, Old Persian served as the language of the royal court, though Aramaic had become the practical tongue of imperial administration. What made this vast assemblage of peoples function as a single empire was not forced uniformity, but rather a carefully maintained system that respected local traditions while ensuring loyalty to the center. In each province or satrapy, the local satrap governed according to established Persian principles, yet the daily lives of ordinary people continued much as they had before the coming of Persian rule. Egyptian temples still honored their ancient gods. Babylonian priests still read the stars and recorded their observations, and Greek cities still conducted their affairs according to their own customs, all within the protective framework of imperial peace. The roads that connected this empire hummed with constant activity. Along the Royal Road, which stretched over 1,500 miles from Sardis to Susa, relay stations stood at regular intervals. Royal messengers could cross the entire distance in just 7 days, changing horses at each station, carrying the king's word to the farthest reaches of his domain. These same roads carried merchants, officials, soldiers, and ideas, creating channels of communication that had never before existed on such a scale. In the great cities of the empire, this mixing of cultures created something entirely new. In Babylon, one might encounter Persian administrators working alongside Chaldean astronomers and Jewish merchants. The city's markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the known world. Silk that had traveled the long route from distant eastern lands, incense from Arabia, ivory from Africa, and precious metals from the mountains of Anatolia. The very air seemed filled with the mingled scents of 100 different spices and perfumes, while the sounds of numerous languages created a constant, peaceful murmur. The cities of the empire varied greatly in character, each retaining its own distinctive personality while participating in the larger imperial culture. Sardis, with its wealthy merchants and Greek influences, felt quite different from ancient Memphis, with its towering monuments and priestly traditions. Ecbatana, nestled in the mountains, offered cool summer refuge with its legendary palace adorned with precious metals. Susa, one of the great administrative centers, bustled with officials managing the complex affairs of empire. Each city contributed its own flavor to the rich blend of imperial life. Daily existence for most people within the empire continued according to ancient rhythms. Farmers across the vast territories still planted and harvested their crops with the changing seasons. In Mesopotamia, they tended the irrigation canals that had sustained civilization for millennia. In Egypt, they awaited the annual flooding of the Nile. In the fertile valleys of Bactria, they cultivated crops in the shadow of distant mountains. The Persian Empire did not seek to change these fundamental patterns, but rather to protect them and ensure stability. Yet the empire did bring certain changes that improved life for many. The standardization of weights and measures made trade more reliable. The introduction of coinage, building on Lydian innovations, facilitated commerce across vast distances. The security provided by imperial forces meant that bandits were less of a threat along major routes. And the systematic approach to justice, while it varied by region, provided some predictability in legal matters. The wealth that flowed into the imperial treasuries from tribute and taxes was substantial, though the burden was generally not crushing for most provinces. This wealth supported the magnificent building projects that were transforming cities across the empire. It paid for the maintenance of roads and bridges, for the upkeep of relay stations, and for the functioning of the elaborate administrative system. It also supported the royal court itself, which maintained a splendor appropriate to the ruler of so vast a domain. In the imperial heartland of Persis, a special energy pervaded the air. Here, the Persian people who had risen to such prominence within a few generations maintained their traditions, while also absorbing influences from across their empire. Persian nobles studied the wisdom of various peoples, commissioning translations of texts and inviting skilled craftsmen from distant lands to work on their projects. The result was a cultural synthesis that honored Persian traditions while embracing the best that other civilizations had to offer. Throughout the empire, a certain pride emerged in being part of something so grand. Local identities remained strong, but many people also came to identify with the larger imperial framework that brought unprecedented peace and prosperity. A merchant in Sidon might consider himself Phoenician first, but he also recognized the advantages that came from being part of the Persian world. An artisan in Miletus maintained his Greek identity while appreciating the opportunities that the vast empire provided for his craft. The religious tolerance that characterized Persian rule contributed significantly to this stability. Zoroastrian fire temples rose in Persian lands, but in Babylon, the ancient temple of Marduk continued its rituals. In Egypt, pharaonic traditions persisted with Persian kings assuming the role of pharaoh. In lands where Greek settlers lived, temples to Greek deities stood unmolested. This acceptance of diverse spiritual paths, unusual for its time, helped cement loyalty across cultural boundaries. As the sun set each evening over this vast empire, from the Hindu Kush mountains to the Mediterranean coast, millions of people went about their lives within a system that had transformed the ancient world. The empire had become more than a political entity. It was a living demonstration that diverse peoples could coexist peacefully under wise governance, that great distances could be bridged through organization and infrastructure, and that respect for local traditions could coexist with imperial unity. This was the Achaemenid Empire at its height, a wonder of organization and tolerance that would influence the course of human civilization for centuries to come, setting patterns of administration and cultural synthesis that later empires would study and attempt to emulate. As the empire reached its greatest extent under Darius, stretching from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Aegean Sea, the king turned his attention to creating a monument that would embody the glory and unity of his realm. On a vast plain in the heart of Persia, beneath the protective shadow of the Mountain of Mercy, Darius chose a site that would become known to history as Persepolis, meaning the city of the Persians. The location itself spoke to the grandeur of Darius's vision. The plain sat elevated above the surrounding countryside, with the rugged Zagros mountains rising behind it like ancient guardians. Here, where the spring air carried the scent of wildflowers and the winter snows painted the peaks white, Darius commanded the construction of a palace complex that would surpass anything the world had yet seen. This would not be a fortress built for war, nor merely a residence for comfort. Persepolis would serve as the ceremonial heart of the empire, a place where representatives from every corner of the vast realm would gather each year to celebrate the renewal of spring and reaffirm their connection to the great king. The construction began around 518 BCE, with workers and artisans arriving from across the empire. Stonemasons from Ionia brought their knowledge of Greek architectural principles. Craftsmen from Babylon contributed their expertise in glazed brick decoration. Woodworkers from Lebanon transported cedar timbers, while metalworkers from Media fashioned golden ornaments. Egyptian sculptors worked alongside Persian artists, and decorators from the eastern provinces added their own distinctive touches. In this way, Persepolis became not just a Persian creation, but a reflection of the empire's vast cultural tapestry, where the skills and traditions of dozens of peoples merged into something entirely new. The complex rose upon an enormous terrace, artificially leveled and extended to create a platform that lifted the palaces above the plain. This terrace, measuring roughly 450 by 300 meters, required the movement of countless tons of earth and stone. Workers carved into the mountainside itself, incorporating the natural rock into the foundations. The terrace was supported by massive retaining walls, some reaching heights of 15 meters, constructed from enormous blocks of dark grey limestone fitted together with such precision that no mortar was needed. A grand stairway provided the formal entrance to the terrace, wide enough for visitors to ascend side by side in dignified procession. The steps were shallow and broad, designed so that the Persian nobility could climb them gracefully while mounted on horseback, maintaining their dignity as they approached the royal presence. At the top of this stairway stood the Gate of All Nations, a massive structure that announced the universal nature of Persian rule. 4 towering columns supported its roof, and at its entrance, enormous stone bulls with human heads stood guard, their beneficent faces watching all who entered. These lamassu, borrowing from Mesopotamian tradition, but rendered in a distinctly Persian style, symbolized the protective power that embraced all peoples within the empire. Beyond the gateway, visitors entered a realm designed to inspire wonder. The Apadana, the great audience hall begun by Darius and completed by his son Xerxes, dominated the complex. This hall could accommodate 10,000 people beneath its cedar roof, supported by 72 columns that rose nearly 20 meters into the air. Each column was a masterwork, its shaft elegantly fluted, topped with capitals featuring elaborate carvings of bulls, lions, and mythical creatures. When sunlight streamed through the high windows, it caught the rich colors of the decorations, illuminating the glazed bricks and painted surfaces that adorn the walls. The staircases leading to the Apadana told stories in stone. Carved in relief upon their walls, marched representatives of the 23 nations of the empire, each delegation depicted in their distinctive dress, each bearing gifts appropriate to their homeland. Here came the Medes in their rounded caps and belted tunics, leading horses. There walked the Bactrians, offering camels laden with tribute. Delegations from Ionia carried bowls and textiles, while representatives from the eastern provinces brought exotic animals. The Ethiopians appeared with elephant tusks and precious vessels. Every figure was rendered with careful attention to detail, showing not conquered subjects, but honored participants in a grand imperial ceremony. These reliefs served a purpose beyond mere decoration. They embodied the Persian concept of the empire as a family of peoples, each contributing their unique gifts to a harmonious whole under the benevolent rule of the great king. The careful individualization of each group, the respectful depiction of their customs and contributions, reflected the same philosophy of tolerance and inclusion that had characterized Cyrus's approach to governance, and that Darius had expanded. Throughout the complex, other structures served various ceremonial and administrative purposes. The Hall of 100 Columns, built later, provided another vast space for receiving visitors and conducting imperial business. The treasury buildings, though more utilitarian, were still constructed with the same attention to quality and permanence. The private palaces of Darius and Xerxes, while smaller than the audience halls, displayed equal refinement in their decorations and appointments. Water flowed through Persepolis in carefully engineered channels, demonstrating the Persian mastery of hydraulic engineering. These waterways not only provided for the practical needs of the complex, but also created pools and fountains that offered cooling relief during the hot months and enhanced the beauty of the courtyards and gardens. Each spring, as the winter rains gave way to warmer weather, Persepolis came alive for the celebration of Nowruz, the Persian New Year. This festival, timed to the vernal equinox, drew representatives from every province of the empire. They brought tribute, presented gifts, and participated in elaborate ceremonies that reaffirmed the bonds between the center and the periphery of the realm. For days, the terraces would fill with dignitaries in their varied costumes, speaking diverse languages, yet all united in acknowledging the authority of the great king and the system that had brought unprecedented peace and prosperity to such a vast region. The artisans who created Persepolis left their marks in subtle ways. Some stone blocks bear inscriptions in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian, recording the names of workers or supervisors. These trilingual texts remind us that Persepolis was a place where languages and cultures met and mingled. The artistic style itself blended influences from across the known world, creating a distinctly Achaemenid aesthetic that was neither purely Persian nor copied from subject peoples, but rather a sophisticated synthesis that represented the cosmopolitan nature of the empire. As decades passed and successive kings added their own buildings and refinements, Persepolis grew into an even more magnificent complex. Yet it always retained the essential character that Darius had envisioned, a symbol of unity in diversity, a demonstration of imperial power exercised not through oppression, but through the celebration of cultural richness, and a testament to what could be achieved when the resources and talents of many peoples were directed toward a common purpose. The Jewel of Persia stood complete, a wonder that visitors from distant lands would describe with awe in their chronicles. A place where the philosophy and achievements of the Achaemenid Empire took physical form in stone and cedar, in gold and lapis lazuli, in the peaceful procession of nations carved forever in limestone relief. As the sun rose over the Persian Empire, casting golden light across the vast territories from the Indus to the Mediterranean, millions of people awakened to begin their daily routines. Beyond the gleaming halls of Persepolis and the administrative centers where officials conducted the business of empire, ordinary Persians lived lives shaped by ancient customs, family traditions, and the rhythms of the seasons. The typical Persian home varied greatly depending on one's station and location within the empire. In the cooler highlands, families dwelt in sturdy structures built from mud brick and timber, with thick walls that kept the interiors comfortable through cold winters and hot summers. These homes often featured flat roofs where families could sleep during warm nights, taking advantage of cooling breezes. In the cities, wealthier families inhabited more elaborate residences arranged around central courtyards, following a design that would influence architecture for millennia to come. The courtyard served as the heart of Persian domestic life. Here, a small garden might flourish with fruit trees, fragrant flowers, and herbs for cooking and medicine. Water, precious and revered in Persian culture, often flowed through these private spaces in channels or collected in small pools. This appreciation for gardens reflected the Persian concept of paradise itself, a word derived from the Old Persian paradisa, meaning an enclosed garden. Even modest households attempted to create their own small version of this earthly paradise, however humble. Inside these homes, rooms opened onto the courtyard, providing privacy, while allowing air and light to circulate. Floors might be covered with carpets or woven reed mats, and cushions provided seating along the walls. The Persians had not yet developed the elaborate carpet-weaving traditions that would later become famous, but they did create textiles of remarkable quality, and the wealthy displayed their status through fine fabrics and furnishings. Family structure formed the foundation of Persian society, with households often spanning multiple generations under one roof. The eldest male typically held authority, though Persian women enjoyed considerably more rights and respect than their counterparts in many neighboring civilizations. Women could own property, conduct business, and receive wages for their work. Records from Persepolis reveal that women worked in various capacities, from skilled artisans to agricultural laborers, and received payment equal to men for comparable work. Meals brought the family together throughout the day. The Persian diet reflected the empire's agricultural abundance and diverse geography. Bread, baked fresh daily in clay ovens, accompanied nearly every meal. Wheat and barley provided the foundation of Persian cuisine, supplemented by rice in the eastern provinces. Fruits grew abundantly in Persian orchards: pomegranates, figs, dates, grapes, and melons. Their sweetness celebrated in poetry and art. Nuts, particularly almonds, walnuts, and pistachios, added richness to many dishes. Persians seasoned their food with herbs and spices that traveled along trade routes from distant lands. Saffron, already precious in ancient times, colored and flavored special dishes. The wealthy enjoyed meat more frequently: lamb, chicken, and game, often prepared with fruit in combinations that balanced savory and sweet flavors. Fish from the rivers and the Caspian Sea varied the diet in certain regions. Wine, produced from the grapes grown across the empire, accompanied festive meals, while most people drank water, milk, or fruit juices daily. Clothing reflected both practical needs and social status. The flowing robes worn by Persians protected them from sun and dust while allowing air circulation in the heat. Men typically wore long tunics belted at the waist, with trousers underneath, a practical innovation that distinguished them from Greeks and many other peoples who wore draped garments. These trousers, particularly suited to horseback riding, would eventually be adopted by cultures around the world. Over these basic garments, people might wear longer robes or cloaks, depending on weather and occasion. Persian women dressed in similar tunics and trousers, covered by flowing outer robes. Unlike in some neighboring societies, Persian women were not required to veil their faces in daily life, though they might cover their heads with shawls for protection from the sun or cold. Both men and women of means adorned themselves with jewelry, bracelets, earrings, necklaces, and rings crafted from gold, silver, and precious stones. The wealthy displayed their status through the quality of their fabrics, favoring fine linens and later silk, dyed in vibrant colors achieved through sophisticated techniques. Education varied by social class, though Persian culture valued certain forms of learning across society. Elite boys received formal education in subjects the Persians considered essential for proper development. Ancient sources describe how young nobles learned to ride horses, shoot arrows, and speak the truth, a curriculum that emphasized both physical prowess and moral character. Reading and writing in the languages of the empire, mathematics, and knowledge of Persian history and traditions rounded out their education. Girls from wealthy families often learned reading, writing, and arithmetic at home, along with skills in managing households and various domestic arts. The presence of educated women in Persian records and the evidence of women in administrative roles suggest that female education, while perhaps not universal, was more common than in many contemporary civilizations. Music and storytelling enriched Persian cultural life across all social levels. Professional musicians entertained at royal courts and noble households, playing harps, lutes, flutes, and drums whose melodies have vanished into time. But music was not restricted to the wealthy. Shepherds played simple pipes in the hills. Workers sang as they labored, and families made music together in the evenings. The Persians loved stories, passing down tales of heroes and kings, of the eternal struggle between good and evil, of clever animals and wise rulers. Professional storytellers moved from village to village, entertaining crowds in marketplaces with epic narratives that could continue for many nights. These oral traditions preserved cultural values and historical memories, weaving together entertainment and instruction in ways that made them memorable across generations. Social customs emphasized hospitality, a value deeply embedded in Persian culture. Welcoming guests and providing generous entertainment was both a social obligation and a source of pride. Even modest households would share what they had with visitors, and refusing hospitality or proving an ungracious guest violated fundamental cultural norms. This tradition of hospitality extended beyond the home to the royal roads, where rest houses provided shelter and refreshment for travelers on official business. Leisure time, when daily work permitted, involved various activities. Men might hunt, practice archery or riding, or gather with friends in parks and gardens. Board games provided entertainment, with finds from archaeological sites revealing elaborate game boards and pieces. The Persians enjoyed sports and competitions, though these focused more on skills useful in warfare, riding, archery, and javelin throwing, than on the athletic contests favored by Greeks. Throughout the year, festivals and celebrations marked the passing seasons and honored religious observances. Nowruz, the New Year celebration coinciding with the spring equinox, brought particular joy. Families cleaned their homes thoroughly, wore new clothes, and shared special meals. This festival, with roots extending deep into Persian history, celebrated renewal and the triumph of light over darkness, themes central to Persian spiritual understanding. As evening descended, and families gathered after their day's labor, as lamps were lit, and the cool night air brought relief from daytime heat. The patterns of Persian daily life revealed a civilization that had created not merely an empire, but a culture. In these ordinary moments, sharing meals, telling stories, teaching children, tending gardens, the Persians built a society whose values and customs would outlast their kings and echo through the centuries ahead. As evening settles across the ancient Iranian plateau, we turn our attention to the remarkable achievements that made Persian civilization a beacon of innovation in the ancient world. Having explored the rhythms of daily life, we now discover how Persian ingenuity transformed the landscape and enriched human knowledge in ways that would echo through the centuries. Beneath the surface of Persia's arid lands, a revolution in water management was quietly unfolding. The Persians had inherited a challenging environment where rainfall was sparse and rivers often ran dry for much of the year. Yet rather than accepting these limitations, Persian engineers developed one of antiquity's most ingenious solutions, the Qanat system. Picture, if you will, a gently sloping underground tunnel stretching for miles beneath the desert floor, following the natural gradient of the land. These Qanats tapped into groundwater sources in the foothills of mountains, channeling the precious liquid through carefully constructed passages that protected it from the intense evaporation of the sun above. The construction of a Qanat required remarkable precision and patience. Skilled workers known as muqannis would first locate a water source, then begin the painstaking process of digging a mother well deep into the earth. From this point, they would excavate a tunnel that descended at just the right angle, typically dropping about 1 foot for every 1,000 feet of length. Along the route, they created vertical shafts at regular intervals, which appeared from above as a line of craters marching across the landscape. These shafts served multiple purposes. They provided air for the workers below, allowed the removal of excavated soil, and later enabled maintenance access to keep the channels clear. The Qanat system transformed Persian agriculture and settlement patterns. Villages and gardens sprang up in places that might otherwise have remained uninhabitable, sustained by the steady flow of underground water. Some Qanats stretched for dozens of miles, representing years of labor and considerable engineering expertise. The cool underground channels kept the water fresh and clean, while the gravity-fed system required no pumping mechanism, functioning reliably year after year with minimal intervention. This technology was so effective that it spread throughout the Persian world and beyond, adopted by neighboring civilizations who recognized its brilliance. Persian achievements in metallurgy were equally impressive, building upon centuries of accumulated knowledge. The craftsmen of Persia had access to rich mineral deposits in their mountainous regions, and they exploited these resources with great skill. Iron working had reached sophisticated levels, producing everything from agricultural tools to weapons of exceptional quality. Persian smiths understood the importance of carbon content in steel, and through repeated heating and hammering, they created blades that were both flexible and capable of holding a sharp edge. The production of bronze continued alongside ironworking, and Persian artisans excelled at creating intricate bronze vessels, mirrors, and decorative objects. They mastered techniques for creating elaborate patterns through hammering and engraving, producing works that combined functionality with aesthetic beauty. Gold and silver were worked with equal expertise, fashioned into jewelry, ceremonial objects, and the elaborate vessels that adorned royal tables. The famous Achaemenid goldsmiths could create pieces of breathtaking delicacy, using granulation techniques to attach tiny spheres of gold to create intricate patterns, or employing filigree work to produce lace-like metal designs. Textile production represented another area where Persian innovation flourished. The empire's location along trade routes gave weavers access to materials from diverse regions, including silk from the distant east and fine wool from their own herds. Persian carpets were already becoming renowned in the ancient world, woven with complex patterns that required both mathematical precision and artistic vision. The vertical loom allowed weavers to create large, elaborate pieces, knotting colored threads one at a time to build up intricate designs that might take months or years to complete. The dyeing of textiles was an art unto itself. Persian dyers knew the secrets of creating vibrant, lasting colors from natural sources. The deep reds came from madder root and certain insects, while blues were extracted from indigo plants. Yellows and oranges came from saffron, pomegranate rind, and various other plant materials. The royal purple, most precious of all colors, required thousands of murex shells to produce even a small amount of dye. These dyers understood the chemistry of mordants, substances that helped fix dyes to fibers permanently, ensuring that colors remained vivid through years of use. In the realm of agriculture, Persian farmers had developed sophisticated understanding of crop rotation, irrigation timing, and selective breeding. They cultivated a diverse array of crops suited to different microclimates within the empire. In the fertile valleys, wheat and barley formed the foundation of the diet. The hillsides supported orchards of pomegranates, figs, and grapes, while the introduction of new fruit trees and vegetables enriched agricultural diversity. Persian gardens were not merely decorative. They served as experimental stations where new plant varieties could be tested and propagated. The famous Persian gardens themselves represented a fusion of aesthetic vision and practical knowledge. These paradises, as they were called, combined flowing water, shade trees, fragrant flowers, and fruit-bearing plants in carefully planned arrangements. The four-part garden design, with water channels dividing the space into quadrants, became a template that influenced garden design across vast regions. These gardens required sophisticated irrigation systems, knowledge of plant requirements, and careful maintenance, representing the application of botanical understanding in service of beauty and repose. Persian engineers also excelled in large-scale construction projects. The building of platforms for cities like Persepolis required moving massive quantities of stone and earth, carefully grading the terrain, and creating drainage systems to protect the structures from seasonal rains. The construction of bridges, some spanning considerable distances, demonstrated understanding of weight distribution and material strength. These stone bridges, with their elegant arches, served the empire's communication needs while showcasing engineering prowess. In the realm of artistic techniques, Persian craftsmen developed and refined methods that would influence centuries of art production. The creation of glazed bricks for architectural decoration required precise knowledge of clay composition, firing temperatures, and the chemistry of colored glazes. These jewel-toned bricks, assembled into elaborate patterns and animal figures, transformed palace walls into shimmering displays of color and form. The technique required careful planning, as each brick had to be shaped and glazed to fit its specific position in the overall design. Stone carving reached extraordinary levels of refinement in Persian hands, working with limestone, marble, and harder stones. Sculptors created reliefs that captured texture and movement with remarkable skill. They understood how to carve deeply enough to create dramatic shadows while maintaining the stone's structural integrity. The polish they achieved on stone surfaces, using progressively finer abrasives, resulted in finishes that seemed to glow in changing light. As we contemplate these achievements, we begin to understand how Persian innovation touched nearly every aspect of life, from the water flowing to distant fields through underground channels, to the lustrous silk adorning a noble's garment. These were not isolated accomplishments, but part of an interconnected web of knowledge, skill, and practical wisdom. The empire's diversity meant that techniques from one region could enrich practices in another, creating a fertile environment for innovation and refinement. In the quiet darkness, we can almost hear the distant tap of the metalsmith's hammer, the rhythmic clack of the weaver's loom, and see the reflection of firelight on flowing water as it emerges from its underground journey, bringing life to the ancient Persian world. As the sun rose over the ancient Persian Empire, casting its golden light across the vast territories from the Indus to the Mediterranean, another kind of light had long illuminated the hearts and minds of the Persian people. This was the spiritual light of Zoroastrianism, a faith that would profoundly shape not only Persian civilization, but influence religious thought across the ancient world for millennia to come. The story of this remarkable religion begins with a figure shrouded in the mists of time, a prophet named Zarathustra, known to the Greeks as Zoroaster. Scholars continue to discuss when exactly he lived, with estimates ranging from the second millennium before the Common Era to around 6 centuries before it. What remains certain is that his teachings transformed the spiritual landscape of ancient Persia and far beyond its borders. Zarathustra's revelation came to him, according to tradition, when he was 30 years old. While participating in a spring festival along a riverbank, he encountered a luminous being who led him into the presence of Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, and 5 other radiant entities. This profound spiritual experience became the foundation of a new understanding of the divine and humanity's place in the cosmos. The religion that emerged from these visions presented the universe as an arena of moral choice. Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity, represented all that was good, true, and orderly in existence. This benevolent creator was not alone in the cosmos, however. Opposing him was Angra Mainyu, a destructive force embodying chaos, falsehood, and harm. Between these two powers, human beings stood as active participants, their choices and actions contributing to the ultimate triumph of good over evil. This concept was revolutionary in the ancient world. Rather than capricious gods who acted on whim, Zoroastrianism presented a rational, ethical framework for understanding existence. The religion emphasized 3 fundamental principles that every follower should embrace: good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. These simple yet profound guidelines shaped daily life throughout Persian society. In the Persian heartland, fire temples rose as sacred spaces where the faithful gathered to pray and contemplate. Fire held special significance in Zoroastrian belief, not as a deity itself, but as a symbol of divine truth and righteousness. The flames were tended with great care by priests known as magi, who maintained their purity and ensured they never extinguished. These sacred fires represented the light of wisdom that dispelled the darkness of ignorance and deception. The fire temples themselves varied in grandeur, from simple structures in small villages to magnificent complexes in major cities. Inside these sacred spaces, priests performed rituals at specific times of day, their prayers synchronized with the movement of the sun across the sky. The faithful did not worship within these temples as congregations might in later religious traditions. Instead, they prayed individually, often outdoors, turning toward the sacred fire or the sun as they recited ancient hymns preserved in the Avesta, the holy texts of their faith. The Avesta contained the Gathas, 17 hymns believed to be the direct words of Zarathustra himself. Written in an ancient Iranian language, these poetic verses explored profound questions about existence, morality, and the relationship between humanity and the divine. Priests committed vast portions of these texts to memory, passing them down through generations with meticulous care to preserve their original form and meaning. Persian cosmology, as expressed through Zoroastrian teaching, divided existence into spiritual and material realms, both created by Ahura Mazda as fundamentally good. The material world was not something to escape or transcend, but rather a place where good could be actively cultivated. This positive view of the physical world encouraged Persians to engage fully with life, to build, create, and improve their surroundings. The religion also introduced concepts that would echo through later spiritual traditions. The idea of a final judgment, where each soul would account for its earthly choices, offered both comfort and motivation to live righteously. Zoroastrianism spoke of an eventual renovation of existence, when good would finally triumph completely, and the world would be restored to perfect harmony. Daily religious observance wove seamlessly into Persian life. Before meals, prayers of gratitude acknowledged the divine source of sustenance. Special prayers marked the transitions of each day, from dawn through midday, afternoon, evening, and midnight. Personal purity held great importance, with regular washing not merely a hygienic practice, but a spiritual discipline. The religion's influence extended into Persian law and governance. The Achaemenid kings, while respectful of the various beliefs practiced throughout their diverse empire, often invoked Ahura Mazda in their inscriptions and presented themselves as champions of truth against the lie. This divine mandate provided both legitimacy and moral framework for their rule, encouraging just administration and honest dealing. Zoroastrian priests served not only religious functions, but also as educators and counselors. They studied the movements of celestial bodies, maintained calendars for agricultural and religious festivals, and preserved knowledge of mathematics and natural philosophy. Their observations of the stars connected the earthly and cosmic realms, revealing divine order in the predictable patterns of heaven. The religion also honored 6 divine emanations, or aspects of Ahura Mazda, known as the Amesha Spentas, or bounteous immortals. Each represented both an abstract quality and a material creation: good mind, truth, dominion, devotion, wholeness, and immortality. They corresponded respectively to cattle, fire, metals, earth, water, and plants. This correspondence reinforced the sacred nature of the material world and humanity's responsibility to care for all creation. Throughout the Sasanian period, Zoroastrianism became increasingly formalized as the state religion. Elaborate ceremonies marked royal coronations and important festivals. The greatest of these celebrations was Nowruz, the New Year festival coinciding with the spring equinox, when renewal in nature mirrored spiritual renewal in the hearts of believers. This ancient celebration, with its traditions of spring cleaning, special foods, and family gatherings, continues to be observed across many cultures to this day. As evening settles over our exploration of Persian spiritual life, we can appreciate how deeply these beliefs permeated every aspect of ancient Persian civilization. From the humblest farmer offering morning prayers as the sun rose over his fields, to the great king making offerings before embarking on important affairs of state, Zoroastrianism provided a framework of meaning and purpose. The religion's emphasis on individual choice, ethical behavior, and active participation in the triumph of good over evil would continue to resonate through the centuries, influencing traditions and thoughts far beyond Persia's borders, even as we prepare to journey along those very borders, following the great roads that connected this vast empire. As the sacred fires continued to burn in temples across the empire, and priests maintained their ancient rituals, another kind of energy flowed through Persia, the constant movement of merchants, messengers, and travelers along routes that bound this vast realm together. The same empire that had devoted such care to spiritual matters had also created something equally remarkable, a network of roads and trade routes that transformed how people, goods, and ideas moved across the ancient world. The most famous of these arteries was the Royal Road, a marvel of ancient engineering, an organization that stretched across the heart of the empire. Beginning at Susa, one of the great capitals in southwestern Persia, this road wound its way westward for nearly 1,600 miles, crossing mountains, rivers, and plains, before reaching Sardis near the Aegean coast. What made this road extraordinary was not merely its length, but the vision and infrastructure that supported it. Along this great thoroughfare, the Persians established a series of way stations, spaced at intervals that allowed travelers to find shelter, fresh horses, and provisions at regular points throughout their journey. More than 100 of these stations dotted the route, transforming what had been an arduous and dangerous trek into a manageable passage. Royal messengers, riding swift horses and carrying the king's correspondence in leather pouches, could cover the entire distance in just 7 days, a speed that would not be matched in many parts of the world for centuries to come. These messengers were no ordinary riders. Selected for their skill and stamina, they formed an elite corps dedicated to keeping information flowing across the empire's vast distances. Neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness stayed these couriers from their appointed rounds, as they passed messages from station to station in an endless relay. Each rider would gallop to the next station, quickly transfer the dispatches to a fresh rider on a rested horse, and the message would continue its journey without pause. This system, which the Greeks observed with admiration, represented one of the first organized postal services in human history. But the Royal Road served purposes beyond official correspondence. Merchants traveling with caravans of goods found these stations invaluable, offering them security and support in a world where bandits and wild animals posed constant threats. The road itself, though not paved throughout its entire length, was maintained and marked, with bridges constructed over rivers and passes cleared through mountain ranges. Guards patrolled sections of the route, and the empire's reputation for order made travel far safer than it had been in earlier times. Other roads branched from this main artery, creating a web that connected all corners of the empire. Routes led south from Persia proper into the lands bordering the Persian Gulf, where ships could carry goods by sea. Roads pushed eastward toward Bactria and the distant satrapies that bordered on India. Northern routes connected the empire to regions near the Caspian Sea, while southern paths led to Egypt and the Mediterranean coast. Each of these roads required maintenance, protection, and the same careful organization that made the royal road function so smoothly. The traffic along these routes painted a vivid picture of the empire's diversity. Caravans from the eastern provinces might carry lapis lazuli from the mountains of what we now call Afghanistan. Its deep blue color, prized throughout the ancient world. Merchants from India brought spices, cotton textiles, and precious woods that commanded high prices in Western markets. From the Mediterranean regions came olive oil, wine, and the murex shells used to create the purple dye so valued by the wealthy. Egyptian traders offered papyrus, grain, and fine linens, while Arabia contributed frankincense and myrrh for religious ceremonies across many cultures. Persian merchants themselves traded carpets woven with intricate designs, metalwork crafted by skilled artisans, and the fine horses bred in the empire's grasslands. The Nicaean horses, raised in Media, were particularly prized. Tall, powerful animals that served as cavalry mounts and symbols of prestige. These horses traveled along the trade routes to distant lands, where rulers and nobles eagerly sought them. The exchange of goods brought with it an exchange of knowledge and culture that proved equally valuable. Scribes in Babylon might hear news of architectural techniques used in distant Bactria. Artisans in Sardis could learn of new methods for working precious metals developed in Eastern workshops. Mathematical knowledge from Babylonian scholars mixed with insights from Greek mathematicians, while Persian astronomers shared observations with colleagues across the empire. The roads carried not just physical goods, but the accumulated wisdom of diverse peoples, creating a flow of ideas that enriched everyone it touched. In the caravanserais, the larger trading posts where merchants gathered, one could witness this cultural exchange firsthand. Travelers speaking different languages, wearing varied styles of dress, and following different customs would share meals, swap stories, and conduct business. An Aramaic-speaking trader from Syria might negotiate with a Persian merchant using interpreters, while nearby, a Greek craftsman examined Indian textiles for ideas to incorporate into his own work. These meeting points became crucibles where cultures blended and new ideas took shape. The empire's use of standardized coinage facilitated this trade. The gold daric and silver siglos, stamped with images of the Persian king, provided reliable currency accepted throughout the realm. Merchants no longer needed to rely solely on barter or worry about whether their goods would be accepted as payment. This monetary system, combined with the relative stability and security the empire provided, encouraged commerce on a scale previously unknown. River routes complemented the road system, with boats carrying heavy cargo along the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus, and other waterways. Ports on the Persian Gulf and Mediterranean coast connected to maritime trade networks that reached even farther afield. Ships from Persia touched the shores of Arabia, East Africa, and India, while Mediterranean vessels brought goods from Greece, Phoenicia, and Egypt. The Persian Empire sat at the center of these networks, acting as both destination and intermediary for goods moving between East and West. The flow of tribute from the satrapies also traveled these routes: gold, silver, livestock, and local products making their way to the imperial treasuries. But this was not mere extraction. The wealth that concentrated in Persian centers funded the infrastructure that benefited all. The construction of irrigation systems, the maintenance of roads, the support of local administration. All of these required resources that the tribute system provided. The same roads that carried tribute in one direction carried government resources, military support, and economic opportunity in the other. As caravans moved across high mountain passes where snow crowned distant peaks, or trudged through lowland heat where date palms offered shade, they connected the empire's far-flung territories into something approaching a unified economic zone. A farmer in Anatolia and a herder in Sogdiana both participated in the same vast system, their products potentially flowing to distant markets they would never see. The Persian achievement in creating and maintaining these connections rivaled their military conquests and architectural wonders, for it was through these routes that the empire truly became more than a collection of conquered territories. It became an interconnected world. The royal palace at Persepolis stood as magnificent as ever when Xerxes took his place upon the throne of his father Darius. The year was 486 BCE, and the new king inherited an empire that stretched across 3 continents, a realm so vast that messengers required months to traverse its breadth. Xerxes, whose name meant ruling over heroes, had been groomed for this position since youth, educated in the ways of kingship within the very halls where his father had made decisions that shaped the known world. In the early years of his reign, Xerxes demonstrated the same administrative capability that had marked his father's rule. He continued the great building projects at Persepolis, adding his own vision to the structures that already inspired awe in all who approached them. The gate of all nations, a grand entrance to the terrace, bore inscriptions in multiple languages proclaiming the king's authority and his devotion to Ahura Mazda. The stone columns rose higher still, carved with intricate details that caught the light of dawn and dusk in ever-changing patterns. Xerxes inherited not only his father's throne, but also his father's ambitions and unfinished campaigns. Yet he first turned his attention to matters closer to home, addressing unrest in Egypt and Babylon with the firm hand of an experienced administrator. The vast empire required constant attention, and Xerxes proved himself capable of managing its intricate systems of governance, maintaining the network of satrapies and the flow of tribute that sustained the imperial court. The king surrounded himself with capable advisors and maintained the traditions of Persian governance that had served the empire well. The royal archives continued to expand, clay tablets and papyrus scrolls recording everything from tax assessments to building projects, creating a vast administrative memory that allowed the empire to function with remarkable efficiency. The satrapal system that had been refined under Darius continued to evolve, adapting to local conditions while maintaining loyalty to the central authority. As the years of Xerxes' reign progressed, the character of Persian kingship began to subtly shift. The court at Persepolis and Susa became increasingly elaborate, with ceremonies that emphasized the divine favor bestowed upon the king. The Persian monarchs had always held an elevated position, but under Xerxes and his successors, the distance between the king and his subjects grew more pronounced. The elaborate court protocol, the prostration required before the royal presence, and the emphasis on the king's semi-divine status created an atmosphere of heightened majesty. Following Xerxes came his son, Artaxerxes III, who ruled for more than 4 decades from 465 to 424 BCE. His long reign brought a period of relative stability to the empire, though it was stability purchased partly through accommodation and diplomacy rather than conquest. Artaxerxes proved himself a shrewd negotiator, managing the complex relationships between satrapies and dealing with the various peoples under Persian authority. The great palace complexes continued to be maintained and enhanced, with artisans from across the empire contributing their skills to the royal building projects. During Artaxerxes' reign, the administrative machinery of the empire hummed along with practiced efficiency. The royal road still carried its endless stream of messengers and merchants. The satrapies still sent their tribute to the royal treasuries, and the diverse peoples of the empire still looked to Persepolis as the center of their political universe. The king's court attracted scholars, artists, and craftsmen, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere where ideas and techniques from Egypt mingled with those from Mesopotamia, where Greek artistic influences blended with traditional Persian forms. The succession of kings that followed demonstrated the challenges of maintaining an empire across generations. Darius II came to the throne in 423 BCE and ruled until 405 BCE, navigating the complex politics of a mature empire where various factions at court competed for influence. The administrative systems remained largely intact, but the unity of purpose that had characterized the early Achaemenid rulers became more difficult to maintain as generations passed and the founding vision receded into memory. Throughout these later decades of Achaemenid rule, Persian culture continued to flourish and evolve. The workshops of the empire still produced magnificent metalwork, intricate textiles, and elaborate jewelry that displayed the technical mastery Persian craftsmen had achieved. The artistic style that had developed over the centuries, blending elements from many traditions into something distinctively Persian, reached new heights of refinement. Palace walls were adorned with glazed brick reliefs, showing royal hunts and processions, their colors still vibrant, their details still precise. Artaxerxes II ascended the throne in 405 BCE and would rule for nearly 5 decades, one of the longest reigns in Achaemenid history. His time on the throne saw continued refinement of the imperial system, though also the first clear signs of the challenges that would eventually face the dynasty. He added his own contributions to the architectural heritage of Persia, building and renovating structures that maintained the grandeur expected of Persian kingship. The vast treasury accumulated over generations allowed for spectacular displays of wealth and artistic patronage that impressed visitors from distant lands. The daily rhythms of the empire continued much as they had for generations. Farmers still tended their fields, irrigated by the ingenious canal systems that brought water from distant mountains. Merchants still traveled the great roads, carrying goods between provinces. Artisans still practiced their crafts in workshops that had passed from master to apprentice across many generations. The empire had become a fixture of the known world, seemingly as permanent as the mountains that divided its satrapies. Yet within the courts and palaces, those who observed closely might have noticed subtle changes. The kings who ruled in the 4th century BCE governed an empire that had existed for more than 2 centuries, and the institutional patterns had become deeply set. Innovation gave way to tradition, and the dynamic energy of the empire's founding generations mellowed into the measured pace of an established order. The satraps who governed distant provinces sometimes seemed more like independent rulers than imperial administrators, though they still sent tribute and acknowledged the authority of the great king. Artaxerxes III came to power in 358 BCE and demonstrated that the Achaemenid dynasty could still produce strong rulers. He worked to reassert central authority over provinces that had grown somewhat independent, bringing renewed vigor to imperial governance. His reign showed that the empire retained considerable strength, its administrative systems still capable of mobilizing resources across vast distances, its cultural traditions still vibrant and alive. The final decades of independent Achaemenid rule saw the empire continuing to function much as it had for generations, a vast and complex organism spanning diverse lands and peoples. The great capitals still stood in all their glory. The relief carvings at Persepolis still proclaimed the majesty of Persian kingship, and the daily life of the empire's millions continued in patterns established long ago. As the 4th century progressed toward its midpoint, few could have imagined that this empire, which had endured for more than 2 centuries, would soon face its greatest challenge and undergo a transformation that would reshape the ancient world. The great empire that had once stretched from the Indus to the Mediterranean, that had endured for more than 2 centuries, now found itself in a period of gradual transformation. The later Achaemenid kings had maintained the splendor of Persepolis and the administrative machinery that kept their vast territories connected. Yet the challenges facing the empire were mounting in ways both subtle and profound. By the time Artaxerxes III ascended to the throne in 358 BCE, the empire faced pressures from multiple directions. Provinces that had once accepted Persian rule with relative contentment now tested the limits of imperial authority. Egypt, that ancient land along the Nile which Cambyses had brought into the empire generations earlier, had successfully broken away and reasserted its independence. The loss of such a prestigious and wealthy province represented not just an economic blow, but a symbolic one as well. Artaxerxes III, determined to restore the empire's former extent, launched a renewed campaign to reclaim Egypt. After an initial setback, Persian forces eventually succeeded in bringing the Nile Delta back under imperial control. Yet this victory, though significant, could not entirely mask the reality that the empire required increasingly vigorous effort to maintain its cohesion. The machinery of government still functioned. The royal roads still carried messengers and merchants, and tribute still flowed to the imperial treasuries. but the ease with which the earlier Achaemenid rulers had commanded loyalty is becoming harder to sustain. The court at Persepolis and Susa continued its traditional splendor. The great festivals still brought representatives from across the empire to climb the magnificent staircases and present gifts to the King of Kings. The artisans still carved their careful reliefs into stone, depicting the eternal themes of royal power and universal harmony. Yet behind this continuing pageantry, the empire's vulnerability was growing. The rise of Macedon under Philip II in the Greek world presented a new kind of challenge. The Greeks, who had been defeated in their attempts to resist Persian expansion more than a century earlier, had remained a persistent concern along the empire's western frontier. The Greek cities of Asia Minor existed in an uneasy relationship with Persian authority, sometimes accepting it, sometimes resisting it, always maintaining their distinctive culture and political traditions. Philip's unification of the fractious Greek city-states created a more formidable power than Persia had faced in that region before. When Artaxerxes III died in 338 BCE, possibly by poisoning, the succession that followed revealed some of the strains within the imperial system. His son Artaxerxes IV ruled only briefly before being removed, and Darius III came to the throne in circumstances that suggested the influence of powerful court factions. Darius III would prove to be the last of the Achaemenid rulers, though he could not have known this when he assumed the ancient titles of his ancestors. The new king inherited an empire that was still wealthy and vast, still capable of mobilizing enormous resources, yet one that faced a gathering storm from the west. Philip of Macedon's assassination in 336 BCE might have seemed to offer a reprieve, but his young son Alexander proved even more formidable than his father had been. When Alexander crossed into Asia Minor in 334 BCE, the Persian response followed traditional patterns. Armies were mustered, Greek mercenaries hired, and strategies debated in the royal councils. The first major encounter at the Granicus River resulted in a Persian defeat, but not one that seemed catastrophic by the standards of previous imperial setbacks. The empire had weathered military reversals before and recovered. Yet as Alexander moved deeper into Anatolia, cutting through Persian defenses and winning the loyalty or submission of city after city, the scale of the challenge became clearer. The Battle of Issus in 333 BCE brought Alexander face to face with Darius III himself. The Persian king commanded a substantial force, yet the battle ended in Persian defeat and Darius's retreat from the field. The symbolism of the great king fleeing from battle resonated throughout the empire. Alexander's subsequent siege of Tyre and his entry into Egypt demonstrated that he was not merely raiding Persian territory, but systematically dismantling imperial control. The decisive encounter came at Gaugamela in 331 BCE, where Darius assembled perhaps the largest force he could muster, drawing on the empire's resources from its many provinces. The flat plains seemed ideal for Persian cavalry and chariots. Yet once again, Alexander's tactical genius and the discipline of his Macedonian phalanx carried the day. Darius retreated once more, this time never to command an army again. The march of Alexander's forces toward the Persian heartland represented an unprecedented crisis. Babylon opened its gates to the Macedonian king. Susa welcomed him. And then came the turn of Persepolis itself, that magnificent ceremonial capital where generations of Achaemenid rulers had received the homage of their subjects. The great palace complex at Persepolis, with its soaring columns and intricate carvings, witnessed scenes it had never known before. While the exact circumstances remain somewhat unclear in the historical sources, the palace suffered destruction by fire during Alexander's occupation. Whether this was deliberate revenge for Xerxes' burning of Athens more than a century earlier, an accident during celebrations, or some combination of circumstances, the result was the same. The ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid Empire lay in ruins. Darius III, pursued across his fragmenting empire, met his end not in battle, but at the hands of his own former subordinates in 330 BCE. The last Achaemenid king died far from the capitals of his ancestors. His authority evaporated, his empire claimed by a Macedonian conqueror barely in his 20s. Yet the end of Achaemenid political power did not mean the end of Persian civilization. The administrative systems the Persians had developed, the cultural achievements they had nurtured, and the traditions they had maintained would prove remarkably resilient. Alexander himself adopted many Persian customs and attempted to blend Macedonian and Persian elements in his governance. He married Roxana, a Persian noblewoman, and encouraged his generals to take Persian wives as well. The infrastructure of the empire, those royal roads and way stations, the irrigation systems and agricultural techniques, the cities and trade networks, all continued to function. The Persian language continued to be spoken. Persian cultural practices continued to be observed, and the memory of Persian greatness continued to inspire. Even as political control shifted to new hands, the foundations laid by Cyrus and built upon by his successors remained embedded in the landscape and in the consciousness of the people. As one dynasty faded into history, the stage was being set for Persian civilization to renew itself in new forms, to blend with other traditions while maintaining its distinctive character, and to eventually rise again under new rulers who would look back to the Achaemenid glory as inspiration for their own aspirations. The great Achaemenid palaces stood silent now, their stones bearing witness to new masters. As Alexander's armies swept eastward, and the young conqueror's meteoric campaign came to its abrupt end in Babylon, the vast territories he had claimed found themselves without a single ruler. In the struggles that followed, Alexander's generals divided his conquests among themselves, and the lands of ancient Persia fell primarily to Seleucus, one of Alexander's most capable commanders. Thus began a period when Greek and Persian traditions would mingle and merge in fascinating ways, creating something neither wholly Eastern nor Western, but a unique blend of both worlds. The Seleucid Empire, as it came to be known, stretched across enormous distances, attempting to hold together lands that had once belonged to the Achaemenids. Seleucus and his descendants established Greek-style cities throughout these territories, with columned temples, gymnasiums, and theatres rising alongside ancient Persian settlements. Yet beneath this Hellenistic veneer, Persian life continued much as it had before. In the villages and towns, people still spoke their ancestral languages, still followed customs passed down through countless generations, still tended their fields with techniques refined over centuries. The new rulers found themselves in a delicate position. While they brought Greek administrative practices and encouraged Greek culture, they could not simply erase thousands of years of Persian civilization. Indeed, many Seleucid monarchs adopted Persian royal customs, wore Persian dress for certain ceremonies, and incorporated Persian administrative systems that had proven so effective under the Achaemenids. The famous satrapy system continued, though now governed by Greek-speaking officials. The old Persian roads still carried merchants and messengers across vast distances, connecting cities that now bore Greek names, but housed populations that remained predominantly Iranian in character. In the eastern reaches of this Hellenistic empire, far from the Mediterranean centers of Greek culture, Persian traditions remained especially strong. Here, in the regions that bordered the great steppes of Central Asia, a people called the Parni were making their way southward. These were nomadic warriors, part of the great Scythian confederations that roamed the grasslands, skilled horsemen who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. Around the middle of the 3rd century before the Common Era, under a leader named Arsaces, these warriors seized control of the region called Parthia, a northeastern province of the Seleucid realm. The moment was opportune for such a move. The Seleucid monarchs were preoccupied with conflicts in the western parts of their domain, their attention drawn to struggles with rival Hellenistic kingdoms. In this distraction, Arsaces found his opportunity. He established himself as ruler of Parthia, founding what would become known as the Arsacid dynasty. At first, this seemed merely a local rebellion, one of many disruptions in the fractious Seleucid realm. But Arsaces and his successors had greater ambitions than simply ruling a single province. The early Parthian rulers moved carefully, consolidating their hold on Parthia itself before expanding their influence. They understood that they needed to appeal to both their nomadic warrior followers and the settled Persian populations they now governed. In this necessity lay the seeds of Parthian greatness, for they began to craft a unique cultural synthesis. They adopted elements of Persian royal ceremony and administrative practice, presenting themselves as legitimate heirs to the Achaemenid tradition. Yet they also maintained their martial heritage, keeping their cavalry forces as the core of their military strength and preserving the customs of their steppe origins. As decades passed, the Parthian realm grew steadily under rulers like Mithridates I, who reigned in the 2nd century before the Common Era. The Parthians transformed from regional powers into masters of a revived Persian empire. They pressed westward, taking control of Media, then advancing into Mesopotamia itself. The ancient city of Ctesiphon, situated on the Tigris River, became their primary capital, a strategic location that controlled crucial trade routes and agricultural lands. The Seleucid Empire, weakened by internal strife and external pressures, could not prevent this resurgence of Iranian power. What emerged was remarkable in its cultural complexity. The Parthians adopted Greek as an administrative language alongside Persian and Aramaic, the ancient tongue that had served as the empire's common language for centuries. They minted coins that bore Greek inscriptions and showed kings wearing Greek-style diadems. Yet these same monarchs also claimed descent from the Achaemenid kings and presented themselves as restorers of Persian greatness. Greek-style architecture appeared in their cities, but it was often modified with Persian elements. creating distinctive hybrid structures. Artists worked in styles that blended Hellenistic naturalism with Persian decorative traditions, producing art that was uniquely Parthian. The Parthian approach to governance reflected this synthesis as well. They allowed considerable autonomy to local rulers and city-states throughout their realm, demanding loyalty and tribute but permitting diverse peoples to maintain their own customs and institutions. This tolerance, reminiscent of Achaemenid practice, helped maintain stability across their vast territories. Greek cities in Mesopotamia continued to operate according to their traditional patterns of self-governance. Persian nobles maintained their estates and local influence. Ancient religious practices continued without interference, and temples of many faiths operated freely throughout Parthian lands. In their eastern territories, the Parthians became intermediaries between vastly different civilizations. As trade routes developed that would later be called the Silk Roads, Parthian merchants and officials controlled crucial segments of these networks. Goods from the distant Chinese Empire passed through Parthian hands on their way westward. Ideas, technologies, and artistic styles flowed across their territories in both directions. The Parthians grew wealthy on this commerce, and their cities became cosmopolitan centers where travelers might encounter merchants from regions thousands of miles distant. The Parthian military remained rooted in their nomadic heritage. Their famous cataphracts, heavily armored cavalry mounted on powerful horses, became legendary warriors. Alongside these heavily armored horsemen rode lighter cavalry, horse archers who could devastate enemy formations with their mobility and skill. This combination of heavy and light cavalry, working in coordination, proved formidable in battle. Yet the Parthians also incorporated infantry and adopted siege technologies from the Hellenistic world, creating a versatile military force that could fight in various terrains and situations. As the Parthian realm stabilized and expanded, it became clear that the interlude of Hellenistic dominance in Persia had ended. A new Persian empire had emerged, one that had absorbed certain Greek elements but remained fundamentally Iranian in character. The ancient Persian heartlands were once again ruled by a dynasty that honored the traditions and customs of that civilization, even as it adapted to new circumstances and incorporated influences from the diverse peoples within its borders. The story of Persia continued, transformed but unbroken, ready to face new challenges and reach new heights in the centuries ahead. The land between the Euphrates and the Indus had known Greek governors and Hellenistic ways for nearly a century, when a new power began to stir along the northern frontiers. From the steppes beyond the settled world came horsemen who would establish themselves as masters of this ancient crossroads, creating an empire that would endure for nearly 5 centuries. These were the Parthians, and their story represents a fascinating chapter in the long continuity of Persian civilization. The Parthians trace their origins to the Parni, a nomadic confederation from the region east of the Caspian Sea. Around 247 BCE, under their leader Arsaces, they seized control of the province of Parthia from the weakening grip of the Seleucid Empire. This moment marked the beginning of the Arsacid dynasty, named for its founder, though it would take generations before their realm would truly rival the ancient Achaemenid glory. The early Parthian rulers were patient builders, gradually expanding their influence while learning to govern settled populations whose ways differed greatly from their nomadic heritage. By the time Mithridates I came to power in the middle of the 2nd century BCE, the Parthian realm was ready to expand dramatically. This capable ruler pushed westward into Mesopotamia and eastward into the Iranian plateau, reclaiming territories that had once been Persian heartland. The Parthians positioned themselves as restorers of Iranian traditions, even as they incorporated elements of the Hellenistic culture that had taken root in these lands. They called themselves the Arsacids, but they also claimed continuity with the great Persian kings of old, creating a bridge between past and present. What made the Parthian Empire particularly remarkable was its position at the crossroads of the ancient world. Their territories stretched across the vital trade routes that connected the Mediterranean world with Central Asia, India, and eventually distant China. As the Silk Road began to flourish during the Parthian period, these Iranian rulers found themselves perfectly positioned to profit from the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures that flowed across Eurasia. Silk from China, spices from India, glassware from Syria, and countless other commodities passed through Parthian lands, enriching their cities and filling their treasuries. The Parthians are perhaps most famous for their military prowess, particularly their cavalry. Unlike the heavily armored infantry that dominated Mediterranean warfare, the Parthians perfected the art of mounted combat. Their armies consisted of two main types of cavalry: the heavily armored cataphracts, both horse and rider encased in scale armor, who served as shock troops, and the lighter horse archers, who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy while riding at full gallop. This lighter cavalry developed a tactic that became legendary throughout the ancient world: the feigned retreat, followed by shooting backward at pursuing enemies, a maneuver that came to be known as the Parthian shot. The relationship between Parthia and Rome became one of the defining features of the ancient world for centuries. These two great powers faced each other across the Euphrates River, sometimes as enemies, sometimes in uneasy peace, but always as rivals. The Parthians proved themselves more than capable of defending their realm against Roman expansion. In 53 BCE, at the Battle of Carrhae, Parthian forces under General Serena destroyed a Roman army led by Crassus, one of Rome's most powerful leaders. The Roman legions, accustomed to victory, found themselves helpless against the mobile Parthian cavalry who circled them endlessly, raining arrows upon their ranks. Yet despite their military reputation, the Parthians were not merely warriors. Their cities grew prosperous and sophisticated, blending Iranian, Greek, and Mesopotamian influences into something distinctive. Ctesiphon, near the site of ancient Babylon, became their western capital, a bustling metropolis where merchants from across the known world conducted their business. The city's markets offered goods from 3 continents, and its streets echoed with languages from Greek and Aramaic to various Iranian dialects and tongues from far-off lands. Parthian art reflected this cultural synthesis. Their craftsmen produced beautiful works that combined Hellenistic naturalism with Iranian motifs and compositional styles. Silver plates and bowls from the Parthian period show scenes of royal hunts and divine figures rendered with sophisticated technique. Their architecture similarly blended traditions, featuring the Greek columned facades that the Seleucids had introduced, but arranged in distinctly Iranian spatial configurations. The Great Hall, or Iwan, a vaulted space open on one side, became a characteristic feature of Parthian architecture that would continue to define Persian building for centuries to come. The Parthian approach to governance was notably decentralized compared to the highly organized Achaemenid system. The Arsacid kings ruled over a federation of noble families and semi-autonomous regions, each with considerable local authority. This flexibility allowed the empire to accommodate diverse peoples and traditions, but it also meant that central authority could sometimes be contested. Succession to the throne was often determined not by primogeniture, but by selection among eligible royal family members, sometimes leading to internal conflicts that weakened the realm. Despite these internal challenges, Parthian culture flourished. Music and poetry were cherished at court, and wandering minstrels carried songs and stories throughout the empire. These bards preserved and transmitted the old Iranian epics, keeping alive the memories of ancient heroes and kings. Though little of Parthian literature survives in its original form, we know that this oral tradition continued to evolve, eventually contributing to the great written epics that would emerge in later centuries. Religion in the Parthian Empire was characterized by tolerance and diversity. Zoroastrianism remained important, and fire temples continued to serve as centers of worship. But the Parthians did not impose religious uniformity on their subjects. Greek deities, Mesopotamian gods, and local cult practices coexisted peacefully. In some regions, syncretic beliefs emerged, blending elements from different traditions into new forms of worship. This religious pluralism was both practical and philosophical, reflecting the Parthian understanding that their vast realm encompassed many peoples with their own ancient traditions. The trade that flowed through Parthian territories brought not only material wealth, but also an exchange of knowledge and ideas. Scientific and medical texts moved along the caravan routes, and scholars in different lands built upon each other's discoveries. Parthian cities became places where Greek philosophy might be discussed, alongside Iranian wisdom traditions, where Indian mathematical concepts could meet Babylonian astronomical knowledge. As the centuries passed, the Parthian Empire endured through changing times and circumstances, maintaining Iranian independence and cultural identity even as it engaged with the wider world. The great noble families grew in power, their estates becoming centers of regional culture and authority. Yet through it all, the Arsacid kings continued to rule from their capitals, minting coins that bore their images and maintaining the ceremonial traditions that connected them to Persia's ancient glory. The empire they had built would eventually give way to new rulers who would seek to restore Persian power in an even more centralized form. But the Parthian contribution to the long story of Iranian civilization would remain significant, a bridge between the ancient Achaemenid past and the brilliant future that awaited. The great Parthian Empire, which had stood for nearly 5 centuries as the bridge between East and West, began to show signs of strain in the early 3rd century of the Common Era. The noble families who had supported Parthian rule were increasingly restless, and the old order seemed to drift without the vitality it had once possessed. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty stepped a family from the southwestern province of Pars, the very heartland where Persian civilization had first emerged centuries before. Ardashir, a local ruler and descendant of a priestly family, began to gather support among those who remembered the ancient glories of the Achaemenid past. His grandfather had served as a guardian at the fire temple of Anahita in the city of Istakhar, not far from the ruins of Persepolis, where the weathered columns still stood as silent witnesses to former magnificence. These ancient stones spoke to something deep in the Persian soul, a connection to a time when their ancestors had ruled from the Mediterranean to India. In the year 224, Ardashir challenged the last Parthian king, Artabanus IV, in battle on the plain of Hormisdargan. The encounter was decisive, and with the victory, Ardashir proclaimed himself King of Kings, consciously adopting the ancient title of the Achaemenid rulers. He established his capital at Ctesiphon, the great city on the Tigris that the Parthians had developed. But his heart remained connected to the ancestral homeland of Pars, which gave its name to the new dynasty, the Sasanians, named for Ardashir's grandfather, Sasan. The founding of the Sasanian Empire represented more than a simple change of dynasty. Ardashir envisioned a deliberate renaissance, a revival of what he perceived as authentic Persian traditions. He and his advisors looked back across 500 years to the Achaemenids, studying their methods of governance, their artistic traditions, and their grand architectural achievements. Yet this was not mere imitation. The Sasanians would create something new, a synthesis that combined Achaemenid inspiration with innovations all their own. One of Ardashir's first acts was to strengthen the role of Zoroastrianism as the empire's spiritual foundation. While the Parthians had been relatively relaxed in religious matters, Ardashir saw the ancient faith as central to Persian identity. He worked closely with the high priest Tanza to collect and organize religious texts, establishing a more unified form of Zoroastrian practice. Fire temples received royal patronage, and the priesthood became an important pillar of state administration, though communities of other faiths continued to exist throughout the realm. The new king reorganized the empire's administrative structure with remarkable efficiency. He divided the territory into provinces, each governed by officials directly accountable to the throne. Unlike the Parthian system, where semi-independent noble families had wielded considerable autonomy, the Sasanian structure emphasized central authority. Royal inspectors traveled throughout the realm, ensuring that the king's justice reached even distant corners. A sophisticated bureaucracy developed, staffed by skilled scribes who maintained records in Middle Persian, a language that would flourish as a literary medium. Ardashir's son Shapur, who became co-ruler and then succeeded his father, proved equally energetic in building the new empire. Shapur I expanded Sasanian territory through skilled diplomacy and military campaigns, extending Persian influence in multiple directions. He was a patron of cities, founding new urban centers and renovating old ones. The kings encouraged crafts and trade, understanding that prosperity strengthened the realm. The early Sasanian rulers revived the tradition of monumental rock reliefs, carving images of their victories and investiture ceremonies into cliff faces throughout the empire. These reliefs, executed with remarkable artistry, showed the kings receiving the ring of power from the divine, depicted on horseback in magnificent regalia, or celebrating their victories. Unlike the Achaemenid preference for showing tribute-bearing subjects, Sasanian art emphasized the majesty of the monarch and the glory of Persian traditions. The reliefs at Nakhshu-Rostam, near Persepolis, and at Bishapur became galleries of royal power, intended to last for eternity. Architecture under the early Sasanians showed tremendous ambition. they developed a distinctive style featuring grand vaulted halls, enormous arched entrances called iwans, and elaborate domed chambers. The palace complexes grew to extraordinary sizes, with reception halls designed to awe visitors with their scale and beauty. Stucco decoration became increasingly sophisticated, with intricate patterns covering walls in geometric designs, floral motifs, and hunting scenes. These decorative programs would influence architectural traditions far beyond Persia's borders. The Sasanian court developed elaborate ceremonial practices that reinforced the sacred nature of kingship. Access to the ruler became increasingly ritualized, with complex protocols governing who could approach the throne and under what circumstances. The King of Kings appeared in magnificent silk robes, wearing crowns of such weight and complexity that some were suspended from the ceiling above the throne. These ceremonies were not merely displays of vanity, but carefully constructed demonstrations of cosmic order, with the earthly king as the reflection of divine sovereignty. The early Sasanian period saw renewed attention to the ancient Persian concept of the world divided between order and chaos, light and darkness. This worldview influenced everything from architecture to social organization. The king's role was understood as maintaining ashar, the principle of truth and right order, against the forces of druj, disorder, and falsehood. This cosmological framework gave meaning to the administrative efficiency, the religious reforms, and the cultural revival that characterized the early Sasanian era. Trade networks that had existed under the Parthians were enhanced and protected under Sasanian rule. Caravanserais, roadside establishments offering food and shelter to travelers, were maintained at regular intervals along major routes. The empire's location ensured that silk and spices from the east passed through Persian territories on their way to Western markets. The Sasanians understood the value of this transit trade and worked to keep the routes secure and well maintained. The relationship with Rome, later the Byzantine Empire, remained complex and often contentious, but it was also marked by cultural exchange. Persian and Roman craftsmen learned from each other. Merchants crossed borders despite periodic conflicts, and ideas flowed in both directions. The Sasanian court became known for its sophistication, attracting scholars, artists, and craftsmen from many lands. As the Sasanian Empire established itself through the 3rd century, it created institutions and cultural patterns that would endure. The revival of Persian consciousness, the strengthening of Zoroastrian traditions, the development of a distinctive artistic style, and the creation of an effective administrative system all contributed to a renaissance of Persian civilization. The Sasanians had succeeded in connecting their present to the ancient past while creating something uniquely their own, setting the stage for centuries of cultural achievement that would follow in the coming generations. The Sasanian dynasty brought with it not merely political renewal, but a remarkable flowering of culture that would shine across the ancient world like the intricate metalwork for which Persian craftsmen had become renowned. As Ardashir and his successors established their authority, they created an environment where artists, poets, architects, and musicians could flourish under royal patronage, producing works that would echo through the centuries. The Sasanian court became a center of refined culture, where ceremony and artistry intertwined to create an atmosphere of splendor that visitors from distant lands would describe with wonder in their chronicles. The kings understood that their legitimacy rested not only on military strength, but on their ability to manifest Persian greatness through cultural achievement. They saw themselves as heirs to the Achaemenids, and they sought to surpass even those ancient glories. Palace architecture during this period reached new heights of sophistication and grandeur. The Great Palace at Ctesiphon, with its enormous arched hall, known as the Tark Kasra, stood as a testament to Persian engineering prowess. This vast barrel vault, soaring over 100 feet high and spanning more than 80 feet without any supporting columns, represented an architectural achievement that left visitors speechless. The enormous E1, or vaulted hall, became a defining feature of Sasanian design, creating shaded spaces perfectly suited to the climate while making bold architectural statements visible from great distances across the flat Mesopotamian plain. The exterior facades of these palaces featured intricate stucco work, carved with elaborate geometric patterns, floral motifs, and occasionally stylized human and animal figures. Inside, the walls sparkled with colored glass mosaics and were hung with magnificent textiles. The Sasanians developed techniques for creating patterned silks that became so prized along the Silk Road that fragments have been found in locations as distant as European church treasuries and Chinese tombs, preserved there centuries after their creation as treasured possessions. These silk textiles revealed the sophisticated artistic sensibilities of Sasanian culture. Weavers created complex patterns featuring roundels containing images of royal hunts, mythological creatures, and stylized trees of life. The symmetry and precision of these designs reflected deep aesthetic principles that balanced repetition with variation, creating harmonious compositions that pleased the eye while conveying symbolic meanings about royal power, cosmic order, and the relationship between earthly and divine realms. Sasanian metalwork achieved a level of technical mastery that influenced craftsmen across a vast geographic area. Silversmiths created elaborate vessels, plates, and ewers decorated with scenes of royal activities, particularly hunting expeditions. These weren't merely decorative objects, but carried meaning about kingship and proper rulership. The king might be shown on horseback, bow drawn, confronting a lion or wild boar, demonstrating the courage and skill expected of Persian rulers. The repoussé technique, where designs were hammered from the reverse side to create raised relief on the front, combined with careful engraving and gilding to produce objects of extraordinary beauty. The rock reliefs carved into cliff faces across the Persian realm served as permanent declarations of royal achievement and divine favor. Unlike the Achaemenid reliefs, which had emphasized the diversity of subject peoples and ceremonial processions, Sasanian reliefs often depicted specific events, particularly royal investitures, showing kings receiving the ring of power from deities, or military victories, commemorating triumphs over enemies. These massive carvings, sometimes reaching over 30 feet in height, were positioned along important routes where travelers would see them and understand the power and legitimacy of Sasanian rule. Literature flourished in the Middle Persian language, which became standardized and enriched during this period. Court scribes compiled collections of stories, wisdom literature, and historical chronicles that would later form the basis for much Persian literary tradition. The Sasanian period saw the written recording of ancient oral traditions, including heroic tales that would eventually be woven into later works. Religious texts were systematically organized, and translations were made of works from Greek, Sanskrit, and Syriac, bringing diverse intellectual traditions into conversation within Persian culture. Music held an honored place at the Sasanian court. Professional musicians developed sophisticated systems of melodic modes and rhythmic patterns. The barbat, a kind of lute, became closely associated with court music, and skilled performers were highly valued. Stories speak of musicians who could create specific moods and effects through their playing, and music theory became a subject of serious study. Court entertainments featured not only music, but also performances by storytellers, whose recitations kept alive the legends and histories that connected the present dynasty to the glorious past. The Sasanian aesthetic emphasized richness, complexity, and symbolic depth. Whether in the design of a carpet, the decoration of a manuscript, or the planning of a garden, Persian artists sought to create works that operated on multiple levels, offering immediate sensory pleasure while also conveying deeper meanings about cosmic order, divine favor, and cultural identity. Gardens, in particular, became highly developed art forms, with their quadripartite layout representing paradise itself, divided by channels of flowing water and planted with fruit trees and flowering plants that engaged all the senses. The royal workshops employed hundreds of specialized craftsmen, each mastering particular techniques passed down through generations and often improved with innovations. Glassmakers produced delicate vessels in brilliant colors. Gem cutters created seals bearing intricate designs that serve both practical and aesthetic purposes. Perfume makers blended essences that would be valued across the known world. The products of these workshops traveled along trade routes, spreading Persian aesthetic sensibilities to distant lands, while also generating revenue that supported further cultural production. This cultural flowering wasn't confined to the capital or to royal circles. Regional centers developed their own artistic traditions within the broader Sasanian framework. Religious institutions commissioned works that reflected their specific needs while employing the visual vocabulary and technical skills that characterized the period. Wealthy merchants and landowners patronized craftsmen, creating demand that sustained networks of skilled artisans across the empire. The Sasanian cultural achievement rested on a foundation of stability and prosperity that allowed resources to be devoted to pursuits beyond mere survival or defense. Agricultural productivity, maintained by ancient irrigation systems and careful land management, generated the surplus that made possible this flowering of culture. Trade brought not only wealth, but also exposure to foreign artistic traditions that Persian craftsmen absorbed and transformed according to their own aesthetic principles. As the Sasanian period continued, these cultural achievements became increasingly sophisticated, building upon earlier innovations while responding to new influences and changing tastes. The artistic vocabulary developed during these centuries would prove remarkably enduring, influencing artistic traditions across a vast area and persisting long after political circumstances had changed, testimony to the power and appeal of the aesthetic vision that Persian artists had so masterfully realized. The palaces and fire temples of the Sasanian Empire housed more than magnificent art and courtly splendor. Within their walls, another kind of treasure was being accumulated, one that would prove just as enduring as any silver plate or silk tapestry. The Sasanian period witnessed a remarkable flowering of intellectual achievement as scholars gathered to study the mysteries of the human body, the movements of celestial spheres, and the fundamental nature of existence itself. In the southwestern city of Gondishapur, something extraordinary was taking shape. Here, under the patronage of Sasanian rulers, particularly Shapur and his successors, an institution emerged that would become legendary in the annals of learning. The Academy of Gondishapur brought together minds from across the known world, creating a unique atmosphere where Greek philosophy mingled with Indian mathematics, where Syriac-speaking Christian scholars worked alongside Zoroastrian priests, and where the medical knowledge of multiple civilizations was collected, compared, and refined. The Academy's medical school became particularly renowned. Physicians studied the works of ancient Greek doctors, carefully translating texts that preserved wisdom stretching back centuries. But they did not merely preserve this knowledge. Instead, they tested it, debated it, and built upon it. The hospital attached to the academy allowed these scholar physicians to observe patients directly, to compare symptoms, and to refine their understanding of how the human body functioned and how it might be healed. Sasanian physicians developed sophisticated surgical techniques and documented their observations with meticulous care. They understood the importance of hygiene in preventing infection, recognized patterns in the spread of certain ailments, and compiled extensive pharmacopoeias listing remedies derived from plants, minerals, and animal sources. Some of these remedies had been passed down through Persian tradition for generations. Others came from India, from China along the Silk Road, or from the Mediterranean world. The practice of medicine in Sasanian Persia reflected a holistic understanding of health. Physicians recognized that a patient's mental state could influence physical well-being, that diet played a crucial role in maintaining health, and that prevention was preferable to cure. They advised patients on lifestyle, on the balance of activity and rest, and on the proper foods for different constitutions and conditions. Beyond medicine, Sasanian scholars turned their attention skyward. Astronomy had long been important in Persian culture, connected as it was to the agricultural calendar and to religious observances. Under the Sasanians, astronomical observation reached new heights of precision and sophistication. Observatories were established where scholars tracked the movements of planets and stars, recording their observations in careful detail across years and decades. These astronomers inherited knowledge from Babylonian stargazers who had observed the heavens for millennia. They also incorporated insights from Greek mathematical astronomy and Indian astronomical traditions. By bringing together these different approaches, Persian astronomers developed more accurate models of celestial motion. They calculated the length of the solar year with remarkable precision, created detailed star catalogues, and could predict astronomical events with increasing accuracy. This astronomical knowledge served practical purposes. Accurate calendars were essential for agriculture, helping farmers know when to plant and harvest. The Zoroastrian religious calendar also depended on precise astronomical observations to determine the proper timing of festivals and observances. But there was also pure curiosity at work, a desire to understand the cosmos and humanity's place within it. Mathematics flourished alongside astronomy as the two disciplines supported each other. Persian mathematicians worked with sophisticated numerical systems and geometric principles. They developed methods for solving complex problems in land measurement, taxation calculations, and architectural planning. The grand structures of the Sasanian period, with their soaring arches and precise proportions, reflected not just artistic vision, but also mathematical mastery. Philosophy and theology also occupied the attention of Sasanian intellectuals. The Zoroastrian priesthood maintained schools where religious texts were studied, memorized, and interpreted. During this period, much of the oral tradition of Zoroastrianism was finally committed to writing, preserving prayers, myths, and theological discussions that had been passed down through generations. These texts explored profound questions about the nature of good and evil, the purpose of human existence, and the ultimate fate of the cosmos. The Sasanian court welcomed scholars from distant lands, particularly during times when they faced persecution or difficulty elsewhere. When the Byzantine emperor closed philosophical schools in Athens, several scholars made their way to Persia, bringing with them texts and traditions of Greek philosophy. Though many eventually returned home, their presence enriched the intellectual atmosphere and facilitated the exchange of ideas across cultural boundaries. Translation became a vital activity in this cosmopolitan scholarly environment. Texts were rendered from Greek into Syriac or Middle Persian, from Sanskrit into Persian, creating bridges between civilizations. These translations were not merely mechanical transcriptions, but required deep understanding of both languages and of the subject matter itself. A translator of astronomical texts needed to grasp the mathematics involved. A translator of philosophy had to comprehend subtle conceptual distinctions. The Sasanian period also saw advances in practical knowledge that improved daily life across the empire. Engineers refined the ancient Qanat system, developing new techniques for surveying underground water channels and maintaining these vital lifelines for cities and farms. Metallurgists experimented with different alloys and smelting techniques, producing steel of exceptional quality that was prized across the known world. Persian steel would later become legendary, its reputation lasting for centuries. Agricultural knowledge was systematically compiled and shared. Texts described which crops grew best in different soils and climates, how to graft fruit trees, and how to manage irrigation systems for maximum efficiency. This practical wisdom, accumulated over generations of farming on the Iranian plateau, was now recorded and could be consulted by landowners and farmers across the empire. The gathering and preservation of knowledge during the Sasanian period created something of immense value. Libraries housed collections of texts on diverse subjects. Scholars trained new generations of students who would carry forward their methods and discoveries. The tradition of careful observation, systematic study, and cross-cultural exchange of ideas became embedded in Persian intellectual culture. As the Sasanian Empire reached its later centuries, these centers of learning continued their work, seemingly unaware of the dramatic changes that would soon sweep across the region. The physicians of Gondishapur treated their patients. The astronomers recorded their observations. The philosophers debated eternal questions. And the translators worked steadily through texts from distant lands. They were building a bridge across time, preserving the accumulated wisdom of the ancient world. and preparing to pass it forward to future generations who would carry it to places and cultures they could never have imagined. As we reach the end of our journey through ancient Persia, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of understanding, looking back across more than 1,000 years of remarkable human achievement. The story of ancient Persia did not simply end when empires fell or dynasties changed. Rather, like a great river flowing into the sea, Persian civilization merged with and enriched the cultures that followed, leaving traces that continue to shape our world today. The administrative genius of the Achaemenids established patterns of governance that would echo through the centuries. When Cyrus the Great created his vast empire, he faced a challenge no ruler had encountered on such a scale: how to govern millions of people across thousands of miles, speaking hundreds of languages, worshipping countless deities. His solution, the satrapy system with its balance of local autonomy and central authority, became a model that subsequent empires would study and adapt. The concept of dividing a large territory into manageable provinces, each with its own governor, yet answerable to a central power, influenced the administrative structures of later Islamic caliphates, the Byzantine Empire, and even found echoes in modern federal systems of government. The Persian approach to cultural diversity and religious tolerance planted seeds that would flourish in unexpected gardens. The Cyrus Cylinder's declaration of religious freedom represented something revolutionary in the ancient world, a recognition that people could worship differently, yet live together peacefully under one rule. This philosophy influenced the development of cosmopolitan cities along trade routes where temples of different faiths stood side by side, and merchants from distant lands conducted business in multiple languages. The very idea that an empire could be strengthened rather than weakened by its diversity was a Persian gift to political thought. The physical infrastructure created by Persian engineers continued to serve humanity long after the empires themselves had faded. The Royal Road, that magnificent achievement of engineering and vision, remained a vital artery of commerce and communication for centuries. The Qanat system, those underground channels that brought water to arid lands, still functions in parts of Iran and Central Asia today, some of them more than 2,000 years old. Persian engineers understood that water was life in their climate, and their elegant solution to transporting it without loss to evaporation demonstrated a deep understanding of both physics and environmental conditions. In the realm of art and architecture, Persian influence spread across vast distances. The distinctive Persian garden, divided into 4 quadrants by water channels representing the 4 rivers of paradise, became a template for gardens from Spain to India. The Mughal gardens of the Taj Mahal, the courtyards of Andalusian palaces, the formal gardens of the Ottoman sultans, all drew inspiration from Persian designs. The concept of paradise itself, that word we use so freely, comes from the Persian paradisa, meaning an enclosed garden, a protected space of beauty and tranquility. Persian artistic motifs traveled along the Silk Road, influencing aesthetics across Asia and Europe. The winged creatures of Persian art appeared in the decorative programs of temples and palaces, far beyond Iran's borders. The technique of creating luster pottery, giving ceramics a metallic, iridescent sheen, was a Persian innovation that spread throughout the Islamic world and eventually reached Europe. Persian textile patterns, with their intricate floral designs and sophisticated use of color, influenced weaving traditions from China to the Mediterranean. The Sasanian contributions to architecture left an indelible mark on building design. Their development of the squinch, that architectural element that allows a dome to be placed over a square room, solved a problem that had challenged builders for generations. This innovation made possible the great domed structures that would define sacred architecture in many cultures. The Iwan, that grand vaulted hall opening onto a courtyard, became a signature element in architecture across the region, appearing in mosques, madrasas, and palaces for centuries to come. Persian cultural refinement established standards of courtly life that resonated across civilizations. The concept of royal protocol, the organization of court ceremony, the patronage of arts and learning by rulers, all reached high levels of sophistication in Persian courts. The very word checkmate in chess comes from the Persian shahmat, meaning the king is defeated, reminding us that this game of strategy, which would spread across the globe, was played and refined in Persian courts. The scholarly traditions preserved and developed during the Sasanian period proved crucial to human intellectual progress. When scholars at Gondishapur collected texts from Greek, Indian, and other sources, translating them into Middle Persian and commenting upon them, they performed an invaluable service to human knowledge. Many classical texts survived only because Persian scholars valued them enough to preserve them. The tradition of scholarship they established, the practice of collecting knowledge from various sources and building upon it, became a model for the great translation movements and houses of wisdom that would follow. Persian medicine, with its sophisticated understanding of diagnosis, treatment, and medical ethics, influenced healing practices across a vast region. The medical texts compiled during the Sasanian period drew on Greek, Indian, and indigenous Persian knowledge, creating a synthesis that advanced the healing arts. Persian physicians understood the importance of careful observation, systematic treatment, and the connection between physical and mental health. The Persian language itself became a vessel carrying culture across time and space. Middle Persian evolved into New Persian, which became a language of poetry, philosophy, and administration across a vast area. Even after political changes, Persian remained a language of culture and refinement, used by poets and scholars far beyond the geographical boundaries of modern Iran. Perhaps most remarkably, Persian civilization demonstrated an unusual continuity through political changes. When one dynasty fell and another rose, when conquerors arrived from distant lands, Persian culture had a remarkable ability to absorb influences while maintaining its essential character. The Greeks who ruled after Alexander gradually became Persianized, adopting local customs and administrative practices. The Parthians and Sasanians both consciously connected themselves to Achaemenid glory, seeing themselves as inheritors and continuers of an ancient tradition. As we conclude our journey through ancient Persia, we recognize that we have been exploring not just a series of empires and dynasties, but a civilization that made fundamental contributions to human progress. From Cyrus the Great's declaration of tolerance to the last Sasanian king's patronage of learning, from the gardens of Pasargadae to the academy at Gondishapur, Persian civilization enriched human culture in countless ways. The legacy of ancient Persia lives on in architecture and art, in systems of government and concepts of tolerance, in scientific knowledge and poetic sensibility. It reminds us that civilization is not measured solely by military conquest or territorial extent, but by contributions to human wisdom, beauty, and understanding. As you drift into sleep, let the story of ancient Persia carry you gently into dreams, remembering that the light of knowledge and culture, once kindled, continues to shine across the centuries, illuminating the path for those who follow. As we bring to a close our journey through the magnificent story of ancient Persia, from the visionary leadership of Cyrus the Great to the splendor of the Sasanian Empire, we hope these tales of innovation, culture, and enduring legacy have gently carried you through the evening. Thank you for joining us on this peaceful exploration of one of history's greatest civilizations. If these calm adventures have brought you comfort, we'd love to have you with us again. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. And now, as the night deepens and your mind settles, we wish you the sweetest of dreams. Good night, fellow dreamer, and may your sleep be restful and your dreams be kind.